The year's around 450 CE, and you're standing in a valley that stretches out before you like the palm of an open hand. Dry, pale, and deeply lined with the cracks of a semi-arid climate that gets maybe 20 inches of rain a year. The sun hasn't yet reached its peak, but already the heat is rising off the white stone in visible waves, blurring the edges of everything in the distance. To your right, a massive pyramid rises so steeply into the cloudless sky that it seems almost to pierce the atmosphere itself. The Pyramid of the Sun, nearly as tall as a 40-story building, built from millions of hand-carried stones stacked without mortar. To your left, down a perfectly straight avenue that seems to have been drawn across the valley with a ruler, another pyramid emerges, the Pyramid of the Moon, and between them and beyond them stretch thousands upon thousands of buildings, temples, apartments, workshops, all arranged with mathematical precision in a grid pattern that suggests the hand of someone who understood not just how to build, but how to plan. The air smells like dust and stone and something else, perhaps the sweat of thousands of workers, perhaps the smoke from cooking fires that have burned continuously for centuries, perhaps just the particular mineral smell of a place where earth has been moved and shaped by human hands on a scale that is almost incomprehensible. What you're experiencing in this moment, standing in the Valley of Mexico, in a city that will eventually house between 125,000 and 200,000 people at its height, is perhaps the most perplexing engineering achievement of the ancient world. Not because it's the biggest, not because it's the most beautiful, though it is deeply, measurably beautiful in ways that can be seen even in the scattered ruins we have today, but because it's impossible, or at least it seems impossible, and yet it existed. Teotihuacan, the name is actually Nahuatl given to the city centuries after it was abandoned, and it means the place where the gods were created, was one of the largest cities in the world during its peak. This wasn't some regional centre. This wasn't a place that mattered only to local peoples in central Mexico. This was a city that rivaled Rome in size during the same period. It was larger than any city in Europe at that time. It had monumental architecture that would inspire awe for thousands of years. It had complex systems of government, trade networks that stretched to the distant corners of Mesoamerica, neighborhoods that housed people from dozens of different ethnic groups and cultures. And it did all of this, impossibly, in a semi-arid valley with no river. Let me say that again because it's the question that should be pulling at your mind right now. How do you build a city of 200,000 people without a river? How do you feed them, water them, sustain them? Rivers are essential to ancient civilizations. They're not optional. The Nile built Egypt. The Tigris and Euphrates built Mesopotamia. The Indus Valley supported an entire vast civilization in South Asia. Rivers are the arteries through which ancient cities breathe. Yet Teotihuacan had no river. What it had instead was something far more remarkable. A system of engineering ingenuity that was so sophisticated, so carefully thought out, that it allowed a city of extraordinary size to flourish in a place where, by all rights, it should have withered and died within a generation. The people who built Teotihuacan didn't have the advantage of a convenient river. They had only their intelligence, their labour, their understanding of the landscape, and their determination to shape a civilization in defiance of the geography they'd been given. And somehow, across centuries, they succeeded so completely that they created one of the most impressive urban centres in the ancient world. The Avenue of the Dead runs through the heart of Teotihuacan like the spine of some massive creature, and if you were to walk its entire length, and walkers did daily for centuries, you would travel for nearly 2 miles, moving from the Pyramid of the Moon in the north, down toward the ceremonial centre in the south, passing through neighbourhoods and markets and temples, beneath the watching gaze of countless buildings that rose 2 and 3 and 4 stories on either side of you. The avenue itself is not quite perfectly straight, but it's close enough that its creators must have used sophisticated surveying techniques to achieve it. Modern researchers believe they used the positions of certain stars, or perhaps the alignments of distant mountains, to guide their construction. Whatever method they employed, the result is a space that feels intentional, purposeful, almost sacred in the way it's laid out. The Pyramid of the Sun dominates the landscape even from miles away. Its base covers approximately 750 feet on each side, about the same footprint as the Great Pyramid of Giza. It rises 210 feet into the air, which is just shy of the height of the Great Pyramid. To build such a structure without modern machinery, without metal tools, without wheeled carts or pulleys, at least not the kinds we use today, represents a mobilization of human labor and human ingenuity that is almost difficult to wrap your mind around. It's estimated that it would have taken 20,000 workers building continuously for 20 years to complete the Pyramid of the Sun. 20,000 people working for 2 decades, carrying stones, shaping stones, arranging stones, just to create this one building. And yet, here's the crucial detail that transforms this feat from impressive to genuinely bewildering. All those workers had to eat. All those people, whether they were full-time construction workers or rotational labourers who contributed a portion of their year to building the pyramid, had to be fed. They had to be hydrated. They had to be sustained through the dry seasons when rain didn't fall and the ground baked under the sun. This is where the real mystery lives. This is where the question becomes not, wasn't that a lot of work, but how did they survive doing it? Because the Valley of Mexico, where Teotihuacan sits, isn't exactly a garden paradise. It's high, about 7,500 feet above sea level, which means it's cool, but also means the air is thin and the weather is unpredictable. It sits in the rain shadow of surrounding mountains, which means most of the moisture that comes from the oceans gets dropped before it reaches the valley. You get a rainy season from May to October, generally, and then a long dry season from November through April. During that dry season, very little grows. The land becomes desiccated. The earth cracks and hardens, and yet 200,000 people lived there. They weren't eking out a subsistence existence. They weren't barely surviving, eating roots and dreaming of better days. Archaeological evidence shows that the people of Teotihuacan ate reasonably well. They had meat, turkey, deer, rabbits, dogs. They had maize, which was the staple crop. They had beans and squash, the other 2 elements of what archaeologists call the 3 sisters of Mesoamerican agriculture. They had amaranth and chia and a variety of other crops. There were markets filled with food. There were different classes of people with different levels of access to resources, certainly. But the city wasn't starving. The city wasn't a collection of desperate people clinging to life in an impossible landscape. So the question that pulls at us, the question that keeps us awake late at night thinking about ancient civilizations and the ingenuity of human beings, the question is how? How did they do it? What engineering marvel allowed them to take this semi-arid, riverless landscape and transform it into a thriving centre of human civilization? The answer, it turns out, lies not in one brilliant insight, but in a series of interconnected systems, each one carefully designed and maintained, each one dependent on the others, all of them working together to create a delicate balance that sustained the city for centuries. And what's remarkable is how they did this without a river, without the obvious advantage that seemed so essential to every other ancient civilization. Imagine, if you will, walking through the central districts of Teotihuacan during the rainy season. Let's say it's August, the height of the monsoon rains. The sky has turned a peculiar shade of grey-green, and the smell of moisture is in the air, that particular petrichor smell that comes when dry earth first receives water. The rain is coming down in sheets, the way it does in the highlands of central Mexico, heavy enough that visibility drops, heavy enough that the stone streets are becoming rivers themselves, channeling the water downhill in carefully planned courses. This is the crucial season. This is when the water comes, and the people of Teotihuacan had designed their entire city, quite deliberately, quite consciously, to capture this water, to store it, to use it, to stretch it across the entire year, even into the dry months when rain became virtually non-existent. They did this through a system of canals. The valley had natural underground springs and aquifers. Water was there. It was just hidden, trapped underground, waiting. The Teotihuacans identified where this water could be accessed, and they dug, and they channeled, and they created a network of canals that brought water from source to storage to distribution. These weren't simple ditches. These were engineered waterways, with careful slopes and angles designed to move water efficiently from one place to another. Some of these canals can still be seen today, thousands of years later, still bearing witness to the precision with which they were constructed. They also built chinampas, that brilliant Mexican innovation that involves creating raised beds in shallow water, layering them with lake sediment and organic matter, creating incredibly fertile growing spaces that could produce multiple crops per year. Now, Teotihuacan didn't have a lake in the way that later cities like Tenochtitlan would, with its famous island city floating on Lake Texcoco. But the water table in parts of the valley was high enough or could be made high enough through manipulation and digging that chinampas could be created. These artificial gardens were astonishingly productive. A single chinampa could feed a family for a year, or contribute significantly to the diet of a large household. When you have thousands of these spread across the valley, all of them producing multiple times a year, you suddenly have a food security system that can support a massive population. But that's not all, because the city also had to handle the rainy season differently than the dry season. During the rainy months, water was abundant, almost too abundant. Floods were a possibility. The carefully planned streets and buildings and plazas of Teotihuacan were engineered not just to move water away but to direct it strategically. Water that fell as rain on the city itself was channeled, sometimes deliberately through the streets, sometimes through planned runoff systems, toward collection points, cisterns, reservoirs. These held the water, storing it for the dry season. Some of these reservoirs were enormous. Modern archaeologists have identified several that were large enough to hold millions of gallons, water enough to sustain the population through months of little to no rainfall. The sophistication of this system, and this is where it becomes genuinely remarkable, was in its integration. The canals weren't just water-moving infrastructure. They were also channels for waste removal, for sewage, for the drainage of grey water from households and workshops. They were constructed with an understanding of how water moves, how it can be directed, how it can be stored, how it can be reused. Some of this reused water-watered crops, some of it went to public baths, some of it was drunk directly. There's archaeological evidence that the Teotihuacans understood basic principles of what we would now call water quality. There's a pattern in where they place certain structures that suggest they knew that some areas of water were better for drinking than others, that contamination was possible and should be avoided. This was a citywide system of water management that was probably unequaled anywhere in the ancient world. The Romans built aqueducts, magnificent structures that brought fresh water from distant sources into their cities. The ancient Chinese engineered dams and irrigation systems, but the Teotihuacans created something different. They took an arid landscape with hidden water resources and transformed it, through ingenuity and planning, into a place where water could sustain not just survival, but civilization on a grand scale. The agricultural system that grew up around this water infrastructure was equally sophisticated. The primary crop was maize, corn as we call it today, and this plant was everything to Teotihuacan. It was food, certainly, but it was also material for countless other uses. The husks and stalks could be used for fibre, for rope, for building material. The corn itself could be ground into flour, cooked fresh, made into countless dishes. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout Teotihuacan shows a diet that was probably 60 to 80% based on corn. But corn monoculture is dangerous. If you grow only one crop, and that crop fails, everything fails. The Teotihuacans understood this, whether through experience or through wisdom passed down from their ancestors. So they planted a diverse array of crops alongside the corn, beans, which not only provided nutritional diversity, but which actually improved soil quality by fixing nitrogen, meaning that planting beans next to corn actually makes the corn grow better. Squash, which provided vitamins and minerals, and which also had the practical benefit of creating shade at the base of corn stalks. Amaranth, chia, chili peppers, tomatoes, and numerous other crops that have been documented through archaeobotanical evidence. The lakes and springs that dotted the valley also provided food, fish, waterfowl. These were hunted and caught and dried for storage and trade. The surrounding hills provided game, deer, rabbits, wild turkey. While probably not the day-to-day diet of most people, these protein sources were important, especially for ritual feasts and for the diet of the elites who ruled the city. And here's something that's often overlooked when we talk about ancient agriculture. The Teotihuacans understood land management. They knew how to rotate crops. They knew which fields could be left fallow to recover their fertility. They understood that intensive agriculture wasn't just about working harder, but about working smarter, about creating systems that could be sustained year after year without depleting the soil. The evidence for this comes partly from ancient texts, and partly from the archaeological record. The layers of soil that tell us what was growing when, the patterns of settlement that suggest careful planning of agricultural zones. The city itself was laid out with this system in mind. The central zones, the pyramids, the plazas, the temples, were ceremonial and administrative spaces. Surrounding them were the neighborhoods, apartment buildings that housed the bulk of the population, but radiating out from the center in a pattern that archaeologists have carefully documented were agricultural zones. These weren't haphazard gardens. These were planned spaces where specific crops were grown, where specific agricultural techniques were employed. Some of these zones were closer to the water sources, some were farther away, some were on sloped terrain where water could run downhill, some were in flatter areas where it could be retained. Each zone was suited to particular crops and particular techniques. This is remarkable because it means that the city's administrators, whoever they were, whatever government structure they maintained, understood that urban planning and agricultural planning had to be integrated. You couldn't just build a city and hope it would be fed. You had to design the city in such a way that food production was built into its very structure, and that's exactly what Teotihuacan's designers did. Trade was another crucial element of Teotihuacan's food security. The city, despite its impressive size and sophistication, didn't exist in isolation. Archaeological evidence shows contact and trade with distant regions. There's obsidian at Teotihuacan from volcanic sources hundreds of miles away. There's cacao, the chocolate plant, which doesn't grow in the Valley of Mexico's climate, but which we find in burial sites and in the residue in ancient vessels. There's evidence of exchange with the Maya cities to the south, with civilizations in the American Southwest to the north, with coastal peoples who brought shells and other marine resources. Some of this trade may have been luxury goods, the obsidian, the cacao, the shells, but some of it may also have been food. In times of local shortage, goods could be traded for maize or other foodstuffs from regions where harvests were better. This created a kind of insurance policy. If the rains failed in the Valley of Mexico one year, trade networks could provide a buffer, could bring in food from elsewhere to keep the population fed until the next harvest. This suggests a level of economic sophistication that goes beyond simple subsistence farming. Teotihuacan didn't just have an economy, it had a sophisticated economy, one that involved long-distance trade, storage, distribution networks. There's evidence of market quarters where goods were bought and sold. There's evidence of different neighborhoods specializing in different crafts. There's a known obsidian working district, a pottery district, areas where certain goods were produced. This level of economic complexity requires both a surplus of food — you can't have specialized craftspeople if everyone is needed in the fields — and a system for distributing that food, getting it from the agricultural zones to the city centre, and from there to the people who need it. The fact that all of this was possible in a place with no river is almost incomprehensible, and yet it happened. For nearly 900 years, from around 100 BCE until around 750 or 800 CE, this system functioned. It fed the city. It sustained a population that at its height may have represented 5 to 10% of the entire population of Mesoamerica. It created a centre of civilization that influenced the culture, religion, art, and politics of the entire region. Let's pause for a moment here and acknowledge something. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe to the Calm Archive and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always check the comments and it's fascinating to see people from all over the world learning about places like this while they're drifting off to sleep. Anyway, back to Teotihuacan, because what happened to this remarkable city is almost as mysterious as how it was built in the first place. The city at its height was arranged in a pattern that was almost ritualistic in its precision. Walk from the south, from the Great Pyramid complexes, northward, and you would move along the Avenue of the Dead. This avenue is about 80 metres wide, roughly the width of an 8-lane highway. As you walk, you would see the facades of temples and palaces rising on either side of you. You would pass plazas where rituals were performed. You would see astronomical alignments built into the architecture. Recent research suggests that the city was deliberately oriented to align with certain celestial events: the rising and setting of the sun on specific days, the movements of Venus, the stars of Orion. The Pyramid of the Moon, which sits at the northern end of the Avenue of the Dead, is actually smaller than the Pyramid of the Sun when measured by base area, but when you factor in the hill upon which it sits, it reaches to nearly the same height. Standing at the base of the Pyramid of the Moon and looking back down the Avenue of the Dead toward the Pyramid of the Sun is an experience that must have been profound. The avenue stretches out before you in a narrow straight line, creating a visual perspective that seems to compress distance, making the far pyramid seem both more distant and more present simultaneously. What all of this implies is that Teotihuacan wasn't just a place where people lived and worked. It was a place with meaning, with ritual significance, with architectural expressions of cosmology and religion. The careful planning, the geometric precision, the astronomical alignments, all of these suggest a worldview in which the built environment was meant to reflect and interact with the natural and spiritual worlds. And it was a place that worked. For centuries, it worked. The water systems functioned, the agricultural systems produced, the population was sustained, the city flourished, grew, developed, reached a point of such prominence that its cultural influence spread across an entire continent. People from distant regions came to live there, merchants from the coast, artisans from the highlands, refugees from conquered cities. They all came, and they were integrated into Teotihuacan's neighborhoods, contributing their own skills and knowledge to the city's growing complexity. The central government, whoever organized it, maintained the systems. The canals were kept clear, the reservoirs were maintained, the astronomical alignments were preserved. Rituals were performed regularly at the Great Pyramids, reinforcing not just religious beliefs, but also the authority of those who organized the rituals. The markets were regulated, the neighborhoods were organized. The vast pool of human resources was coordinated and directed toward maintaining and improving the city. This is the mystery that we're approaching now. Not just how Teotihuacan survived without a river, but how such an enormous, complex, tightly organized system ever came to be built in the first place. What inspired whoever founded this city to imagine that such a place could exist? What knowledge did they possess about water, about agriculture, about engineering? Where did they come from, these people who decided to build one of the greatest cities of the ancient world in an unlikely location, in defiance of geography? The answer to that question takes us back further still. Back before the pyramids, back before the Avenue of the Dead, back before even the city that would become Teotihuacan. It takes us to an earlier period, a time of smaller settlements and different ways of life, when the people of the Valley of Mexico were just beginning to imagine what their civilization could become. The city that fed 200,000 people with no river. How did Teotihuacan survive? Section 2. The Origins. To understand Teotihuacan, we have to step back in time much further than the city itself. We have to go back to the time before Teotihuacan was even a thought in anyone's mind. We have to imagine the Valley of Mexico thousands of years ago, long before the monumental pyramids that would eventually touch the sky, before the vast ceremonial plazas, before anything resembling a city existed at all. It's one of the great paradoxes of human history that one of the world's most magnificent ancient cities rose not in a location chosen for its resources or abundance, but in a place that presented an almost impossible challenge. And yet that challenge, that constraint, may have been exactly what transformed a scattered group of settlements into something extraordinary. But before we get to that part of the story, we need to understand the people who arrived first, which is where things become wonderfully mysterious. Here's what historians and archaeologists will tell you. We don't really know who founded Teotihuacan. We don't know their names, their language, or even with complete certainty where they came from, though we have our theories. The Aztecs, who arrived in the Valley of Mexico centuries after Teotihuacan had risen and fallen, called the city Teotihuacan, which in their Nahuatl language meant the place where the gods were created, or where one becomes divine. The Aztecs themselves seem to have believed that this was a place of cosmic significance built by an ancient people whose identities were already lost to time. Imagine that for a moment, a city so old and impressive that even the mighty Aztec civilization, itself an empire of hundreds of thousands, looked upon its ruins with awe and a kind of reverential confusion. The founders of Teotihuacan lived thousands of years before the Aztecs walked the earth, yet their legacy was so profound that it echoed through the centuries, leaving the Aztecs to wonder and speculate about what gods or legendary beings could have constructed such a place. The Valley of Mexico itself was a remarkable setting, high, cool, and surrounded by volcanic mountains that seemed to touch the clouds. This was a landscape born from fire and cataclysm. Millions of years before any humans arrived, this valley had been shaped by volcanic eruptions of staggering proportions. The mountains that framed the valley, Popocatépetl, Iztaccíhuatl, and Xitle among them, were still active, still capable of reshaping the land below them. The ground beneath the valley floor was honeycombed with lava tubes and underground caverns, relics of that volcanic history. This was not gentle, forgiving terrain. This was a landscape that demanded respect, that kept its secrets in deep chambers of basalt and obsidian. The soil, though, was remarkably fertile. Volcanic soil is rich with minerals that feed plants, and the valley's elevation, roughly 7,000 feet above sea level, gave it a temperate climate, cool and pleasant even during the day. But there was one problem that overshadowed all of these advantages: water, or rather, the relative scarcity of it. In 1000 BCE, when the earliest settlements began to appear in the Valley of Mexico, the region received seasonal rainfall, but no mighty river ran through it, no continuous source of water that could support a large population. There were springs scattered throughout the valley, and there were seasonal streams that ran during the rainy months and then dried up when the sun returned, but nothing comparable to the Nile, nothing that could reliably feed and sustain an empire. This was the puzzle that the early settlers faced. How do you build something great in a place where water is precious? And yet, they came anyway. People were drawn to this valley for reasons that made sense to them at the time. The obsidian was here, that black volcanic glass that could be sharpened to an edge as fine as any modern surgical blade. Obsidian was incredibly valuable in Mesoamerica. It was used for tools, for ritual blades, for mirrors and ornaments that conveyed status and power. The Valley of Mexico sat at the heart of the richest obsidian deposits in all of Mesoamerica. If you wanted obsidian, you had to come to the Valley of Mexico. Imagine walking through the valley around 1500 BCE. The pyramids hadn't been built yet. There were no grand plazas or monuments. What you would have seen instead were small villages and settlements scattered across the landscape, like seeds cast on dark soil. These were farming communities, loosely organized, probably operating somewhat independently of one another. The people lived in simple dwellings made from adobe and wood, structures that seemed to grow naturally from the earth. They farmed maize, beans, and squash, this sacred triad of Mesoamerican agriculture that could sustain populations when cultivated with skill and patience. They hunted deer and gathered wild plants from the slopes of the mountains. They traded obsidian with peoples from distant regions, and obsidian flowed through their hands like a form of currency. These were not primitive people. They had sophisticated knowledge of agriculture, of astronomy, of construction, and of the rhythms of the natural world. But they were dispersed, disconnected, each village managing its own affairs, its own survival. Over centuries, something began to shift. It wasn't a sudden transformation. History rarely works that way. Instead, it was gradual, incremental, a slow coalescence of smaller communities into something larger. One village grew slightly larger than its neighbours. It became a gathering place for trade, a place where obsidian merchants met, where goods were exchanged, where people came to celebrate religious ceremonies. As it grew, it attracted more people. Some came to trade, others to settle permanently. The population that had been spread thinly across the valley began to concentrate in certain areas. The region around present-day Teotihuacan was particularly attractive for reasons that we're beginning to understand. There were springs here, more than in some other parts of the valley. The soil was deep and rich. The location sat on what would become crucial trade routes connecting different regions of Mesoamerica. And there was something else, something beneath the earth, something that wouldn't be fully understood until the 20th century. Then, sometime between 100 BCE and 100 CE, we can't pinpoint it more precisely than that, something happened that may have accelerated the growth of Teotihuacan dramatically. This is where the mystery deepens, and where we have to acknowledge that our knowledge has real limits. The leading theory among many archaeologists and historians involves volcanic activity. The volcano Zitla, which lies south of the Valley of Mexico, appears to have erupted around the time that Teotihuacan was beginning its rapid expansion. There's also evidence of activity from Popocatépetl, the great volcano to the southeast whose name means smoking mountain in Nahuatl. These eruptions, whether they occurred simultaneously or in sequence, would have been catastrophic events. Massive outpourings of lava, volcanic ash falling like dark snow across the region, the sky itself darkening at midday. Crops would have failed. Villages would have been buried. People would have fled. And where did they go? Many scholars believe that populations from the devastated areas to the south fled northward, to the Valley of Mexico, where the damage from the volcanic eruption was less severe or perhaps entirely absent. Picture that migration for a moment. Thousands of people, families with whatever possessions they could carry, animals, seeds, knowledge passed down through generations, all moving northward in the shadow of environmental catastrophe. They came from communities that had been destroyed or rendered uninhabitable. They carried with them their skills, their religious practices, their engineering knowledge, and they arrived in a valley where smaller settlements already existed. Settlements that had knowledge of the local water sources, the local terrain, the local trade networks. What would have happened when these refugee populations merged with the existing communities? There would have been conflict, certainly, but also exchange. There would have been a need for organisation, for coordination of resources, for leadership that could manage a suddenly much larger population. The humble villages of the Valley of Mexico suddenly had to grow up and become something more complex. They had to become essentially a city. This is one of the most compelling theories about Teotihuacan's origin, and it makes intuitive sense. Disasters often drive human innovation and change. But we have to be honest. This is still a theory. The archaeological evidence supports it, but it doesn't prove it definitively. We don't have written records from those early days. The people of Teotihuacan didn't develop a written language that survived, or if they did, we haven't learned to read it. We don't have oral histories passed down to later peoples that have survived with clarity and detail. We have pottery, we have remains of structures, we have obsidian tools and ceremonial objects. We have the land itself, and what it tells us about climate and geology. But the founding narrative of Teotihuacan is something we have to infer, something we have to piece together like an incomplete puzzle, where we know the picture, but are missing some of the pieces. What we do know with great certainty is that around the time of the Common Era, right around the year 0 by our modern calendar, Teotihuacan entered a phase of rapid and sustained growth. The population expanded. More structures were built, larger and more organised than what had come before. And as the city grew, it faced a critical challenge that would determine whether it could sustain itself or whether it would collapse under its own weight. That challenge was water. In a valley with no river, with only scattered springs and seasonal streams, how do you feed a population that was growing year after year, generation after generation? You have to innovate, you have to engineer solutions. You have to apply intelligence and patience and collective effort to the problem of water management. But before we get to those solutions, there's something else we need to understand. Something that's literally beneath our feet when we stand in Teotihuacan today. In 1971, archaeologists working at the Pyramid of the Sun made a discovery that changed our understanding of the city fundamentally. They discovered a cave, not a small cave, not a minor natural feature, but a large lava tube that extended deep beneath the pyramid. The cave was so significant that they could trace it down through multiple levels, a natural tunnel in the rock, created millennia ago when molten lava had flowed and then retreated, leaving behind a hollow channel. This wasn't a cave that someone had carved out of the rock. This was a natural formation, shaped by the planet itself long before any human ancestors walked the Earth. The discovery was electrifying because it suggested something remarkable. The Pyramid of the Sun may not have been built randomly. It may have been built deliberately, placed precisely over this sacred cave. In Mesoamerican cosmology, caves were deeply sacred places. They were seen as entrances to the underworld, as places where the gods dwelled, as sources of life-giving water and fertility. The fact that a natural cave existed beneath the city's most important pyramid suggested that the founders of Teotihuacan may have recognized and revered this sacred space. The pyramid may have been constructed as a way of honoring and protecting the cave, of making visible and monumental what was hidden beneath the earth. Some scholars have even suggested that the city's entire layout, its precise geometric orientation, its system of avenues and plazas, may have been designed with reference to this underground space. The visible city, in other words, reflected and honoured the sacred invisible city beneath. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine walking through the streets of early Teotihuacan, let's say around the time of the 1st century CE, when the city was beginning to take its recognisable shape. The sun is warm on your face but not uncomfortably hot. You're at high altitude and there's a breeze from the surrounding mountains. The air smells of earth and stone and burning wood from cooking fires. You hear voices, the sounds of construction, the crack of obsidian being worked into shape, the thud of stone tools shaping larger blocks, the murmur of conversations in a language we can no longer hear, a language that died thousands of years ago. Around you, structures are rising. Some are small, houses where families live. Others are larger, what will eventually become temples and palaces and administrative centers. The work is organized, purposeful. There's a plan unfolding here, a vision of what this place will become. If you were to look upward from where you stand, you would see the mountains on the horizon, Popocatépetl's cone-shaped peak visible to the southeast. If you were to look downward, if you could see through the earth itself, you would perceive the vast labyrinth of lava tubes and underground chambers, the secret network of channels and passages that the city's builders were beginning to understand and exploit. Some of these natural caves and lava tubes held water. Springs bubbled up at certain points where groundwater reached the surface. These were the city's greatest treasures, worth far more than any of the obsidian that the traders prized. The early engineers of Teotihuacan were learning to read the landscape, to understand where water emerged from the earth, to recognize that the solution to the city's water problem was to work with the geology, not against it. The first sophisticated water management systems in Teotihuacan appear to have been constructed during this early expansion period. The engineers built canals to direct water from springs to places where it was needed. They created a network of basins and reservoirs to collect and store water during the rainy season so that it could be used during the dry months. These were not simple channels. They were engineered systems that required understanding slope and gravity and volume and flow rates. The builders would have had to experiment, to make mistakes and learn from them, to gradually refine their systems until they worked reliably. Each improvement would have allowed the population to grow a bit more, to support a few more families, and as the population grew, the pressure to improve water management increased further, driving innovation. The springs around Teotihuacan would eventually become the focal points of the entire city, places of religious significance, places around which temples and important structures were built. Water and religion became intertwined in the minds of the city's inhabitants. The water that flowed from these springs wasn't just a practical resource, it was a gift from the gods, a manifestation of divine power, a symbol of fertility and life. The sacred cave beneath the Pyramid of the Sun, in particular, likely became the most sacred place in the entire city. We don't know exactly how the cave was used, whether there were ritual ceremonies conducted deep within its darkness, whether pilgrims travelled into it seeking visions or blessings, whether it was simply understood as a profound sacred space that grounded the city's spiritual and practical relationship with water. But its presence must have been felt by everyone who lived in Teotihuacan. It was a reminder that the city was built not on the arbitrary choice of humans alone, but on a sacred geography that the gods themselves had written into the stone and the earth. As the population continued to grow, and we're talking about thousands of people becoming tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands over the course of centuries, the city's sophistication deepened. What had started as scattered villages of farming communities was transforming into something unprecedented in Mesoamerica. Teotihuacan was becoming not just large, but organized in a way that suggested central planning, powerful leadership, and a shared vision of what a city should be. The famous Street of the Dead, that long processional avenue that still dominates the landscape today, was being constructed. The large temple complexes that would define the city's religious life were rising. The residential compounds where people lived were being built according to standards that suggest some kind of zoning or planning authority. All of this required coordination and resources and labour on an enormous scale. It required that thousands of people agreed to put in effort toward collective projects that might not directly benefit them individually, but would benefit their families and their community as a whole. How did this level of organisation emerge? That's another of the great questions of Teotihuacan's history. We don't see obvious evidence of a conquering military force imposing order from outside. We don't see clear evidence of a powerful individual ruler whose personal charisma or force of personality drove the transformation. Instead, it appears that the growth of Teotihuacan was more organic, more emergent, the result of people recognizing that their survival depended on cooperation, that water was too precious and too vital to be managed by individual families or even by individual villages, that the challenge of feeding 200,000 people in a valley with no river could only be met through sustained collective effort. The obsidian trade probably played a role in this transformation as well. As Teotihuacan became a more important trading centre, obsidian flowing through the city became a source of wealth and power. Merchants would have accumulated capital, a merchant class would have developed, people with resources and connections to other regions. Some individuals would have become wealthy and influential. Status differences would have emerged. The simple egalitarian villages of the early period would have gradually become more hierarchical, as power and wealth became increasingly concentrated in fewer hands. But unlike many other ancient cities, where wealth and power translated into brutal domination and slavery, Teotihuacan seems to have developed a different model, one in which the ruling class's power was tied to their ability to solve collective problems and to manage shared resources. Your authority came from keeping the people fed and hydrated. Your legitimacy came from ensuring that the water flowed and that the crops grew. This may be why Teotihuacan was able to sustain itself for so long and grow to such an enormous size, because the entire social structure was built on meeting a fundamental need. The early centuries of Teotihuacan's existence, then, were a period of experimentation and innovation and painful learning. The people who built the city had to solve problems that no one before them had solved on this scale. They had to develop water management systems that could support hundreds of thousands of people. They had to figure out how to coordinate labor on massive construction projects. They had to develop trade relationships with distant regions. They had to create a spiritual and religious framework that made sense of their challenging environment and that bound people together in shared belief and practice. They had to build a city not in a place that offered obvious abundance, but in a place that offered obsidian, geography, and the possibility of innovation. That possibility is what drew people to the Valley of Mexico and what kept them there as they struggled to transform scattered settlements into one of the ancient world's greatest cities. The volcanic catastrophe that may have driven refugees into the valley had forced evolution and innovation. The mysterious cave beneath the Pyramid of the Sun had offered a sense of sacred connection to the earth and its waters. The obsidian had provided wealth and trade connections, and the people, the unknown people whose names we will never know, but whose intelligence and determination echo across 3,000 years, had done the rest. In the next section of our journey, we'll move beyond the origins and begin to explore the systems that the people of Teotihuacan built. We'll examine the sophisticated networks of springs and canals that made the impossible possible. We'll walk along the Street of the Dead and begin to understand how the city was organized. We'll climb the pyramids in our minds and see the city spread below us as the people of Teotihuacan saw it. But for now, just rest here for a moment in these early centuries. Imagine the wonder that the first inhabitants must have felt as they realized that this challenging, demanding, beautiful place could be not just survived, but transformed into something magnificent. Imagine the quiet confidence they must have developed as their water systems proved themselves reliable, as their crops grew, as their city continued to attract new residents and new possibilities. In overcoming the constraint of having no river, the people of Teotihuacan had discovered something profound about human ingenuity and collective will. They had discovered that sometimes the greatest achievements come not in response to abundance, but in response to scarcity, and that discovery would shape everything that came next. The water beneath Teotihuacan tells a story that challenges everything we think we know about urban planning and necessity. Imagine standing on the Avenue of the Dead around the 4th century, listening to the sound of water rushing through the city. Water that the early Teotihuacanos had convinced to flow where it would never naturally want to go. The city's greatest achievement was not the pyramids that still dominate the landscape, nor the sprawling residential complexes that house tens of thousands of families. It was water. Water diverted, channeled, captured, stored, and distributed with such precision that it made a city of impossible scale possible in one of the most water-scarce regions of Mesoamerica. The San Juan River, or Rio San Juan as the Spanish would later call it, flowed through the region, but did not naturally pass through the place where the city's founders had decided to build their metropolis. This was no accident. The Teotihuacanos studied the river, understood its rhythms, and made a decision that would echo through centuries. They would not accept the river's natural course. Instead, they would redirect it. They would bend it to their will with stone channels and engineering that, when you understand the tools available to them, borders on the miraculous. The river was captured upstream, its waters channeled into a series of carefully constructed aqueducts and canals that brought it running beneath and through the city at right angles to the Avenue of the Dead itself. Picture this feat. Thousands of workers moving stone, shaping channels, creating the infrastructure that would allow a river to flow where human ingenuity demanded it flow. This was not merely a practical solution, it was a statement of power. The Teotihuacanos were announcing to the world that they controlled not just their city, but the very forces of nature that surrounded it. The sophistication of the canalization system reveals engineering knowledge that would not be matched again until the Roman period in Europe and beyond. Beneath the streets of Teotihuacan ran a network of stone-lined channels, some of them covered, some open to the air, all of them carefully engineered to manage the flow of water through the city's most densely populated areas. These were not crude ditches or haphazard waterways. They were precision instruments of hydraulic engineering. The channels were lined with stone, carefully cut and fitted, and in many cases coated with a waterproof plaster made from lime and volcanic ash. This plaster, called cal, was mixed with volcanic pumice and groundstone, creating a surface that resisted erosion and kept water from seeping away into the porous volcanic soil beneath the city. The Teotihuacanos had learned that they could not simply dig a channel and expect water to stay in it. The ground beneath their city was volcanic and absorbent. Water would drain away, disappearing into the earth as if it had never been there at all. So they sealed their channels, creating conduits that kept every precious drop moving where they intended it to move. The main channel system ran roughly beneath the Avenue of the Dead, the city's principal north-south axis, carrying water from the redirected San Juan River through the heart of the metropolis. But the main channel was only the beginning. Branching off from these primary conduits was a vast network of secondary channels, some smaller in scale, some feeding into specific neighborhoods, some directing water toward agricultural areas beyond the city's immediate boundaries. These channels were engineered with slope and gradient in mind. The Teotihuacanos understood that water needed to flow downhill, and they had calculated, through observation and experimentation, through the accumulated knowledge of hundreds of years of water management, precisely how much slope was necessary to maintain optimal flow rates without water moving so quickly that it caused erosion within the channels themselves. The water had to move, but it had to move with control. Too slow, and it would stagnate, become unusable, perhaps grow dangerous to the health of those who relied upon it. Too fast, and the channels themselves would be torn apart by the force of the current. Many of these channels were covered with stone slabs, transforming them into underground passages that protected the water from contamination and from the intense sun that would have caused excessive evaporation. The covered sections were particularly important during the dry season, when every drop counted and water that could be saved was water that meant survival. Walking through Teotihuacan today, archaeologists can still trace these underground channels, can still follow the pathways that water took through the city more than 1,500 years ago. In some areas, the channels were wide enough for a person to crouch and move through them, maintenance passages where workers could go to clear blockages or repair the stone walls. In other areas, they were barely wide enough for a hand to reach inside, designed purely for the efficient movement of water with minimal surface area exposed to the air and its drying effects. The drainage system that complemented the water delivery system was equally ingenious, and perhaps even more crucial to the city's success. A city of 200,000 people produces enormous amounts of wastewater. Water that falls as rain, water that is used in daily life and becomes contaminated, water that must be managed and removed or it will create swamps, breeding grounds for disease, conditions that would make urban life impossible. The Teotihuacanos did not simply allow water to pool in the streets. Instead, they created an integrated system of covered drains and open channels that captured water from streets, courtyards, and residential spaces and channeled it away from the areas where people lived and worked. Rainwater that fell on flat rooftops was directed toward channels built into the architecture itself. Water that was used for cleaning, for bathing, for the various purposes of daily life flowed through grooves cut into the stone floors of homes and plazas, guided toward drain openings where it could be captured and channeled away. This underground drainage network operated almost invisibly to the people of Teotihuacan, yet it was absolutely essential to their existence. Without it, the city would have become a swamp. The valley of Teotihuacan receives most of its rainfall during the summer months, from May through October, and this rainfall can be substantial. When it rains in the Valley of Mexico, it rains heavily. The streets would flood, the plazas would become lakes, and the low-lying residential areas would be submerged if there were no system to channel the water away. But the drainage system anticipated this challenge and met it with stone channels and covered conduits that moved water out of the city toward the surrounding valley, where it could be dispersed across agricultural lands or allowed to soak into the ground in areas far from human habitation. The genius of this system was that it was dual purpose. The same channels that drained away excess water during the rainy season could be used to convey water from the San Juan River aqueduct system during the dry season when rainfall was scarce. Reservoirs and collection basins scattered throughout the city, and its surrounding areas represented another crucial component of the water management system. Water storage was perhaps the most fundamental challenge facing any ancient city in a semi-arid environment, and the Teotihuacanos solved it by creating a series of basins where water could be accumulated and held until it was needed. The largest of these reservoirs were monumental in scale, capable of holding thousands of cubic meters of water, enough to sustain the city during extended dry periods when neither the San Juan River aqueduct nor rainfall could be relied upon. Archaeological surveys have identified the remains of several major reservoirs, some of them located at the city's edges, others integrated into the temple complexes and public buildings at the city's heart. These were not simple holes dug into the ground. They were engineered structures with carefully sloped sides and waterproofed surfaces designed to maximize storage capacity while minimizing evaporation and seepage. The collection basins served a different but equally important purpose. Positioned throughout the residential and public areas of the city, these basins captured water flowing through the canal system and made it available for immediate use, for drinking, for cleaning, for watering gardens and small agricultural plots that existed even within the city's boundaries. A person living in Teotihuacan would not have needed to walk very far to access fresh water from a basin fed by the aqueduct system. The placement of these basins reveals careful urban planning. They were distributed throughout the city in a pattern that ensured no one lived more than a short distance from a reliable water source. This was public health planning on an advanced level, a recognition that access to fresh water was fundamental to the survival of a large urban population. The basins were typically constructed from stone and lined with the same waterproof plaster used for the channels. In many cases, they had overflow systems, outlets that allowed excess water to drain away toward the canal network so that basins would not overflow during heavy flow periods, which would have wasted precious water and damaged the surrounding area. The natural springs that existed in the hills surrounding the valley of Teotihuacan represented another source of water that the Teotihuacanos learned to exploit with remarkable sophistication. Springs emerge where groundwater reaches the surface, forced upward by geological conditions beneath the earth. These springs are relatively reliable year-round water sources, less subject to the seasonal variations that affect rainfall and the flow of rivers. The Teotihuacanos did extensive work to identify these springs, to channel them, and to transport their waters into the city. In some cases, they built aqueducts that ran for kilometers, following natural contours and maintaining the careful gradient necessary for water to flow by gravity alone. No pumps, no human intervention beyond the initial engineering. These aqueduct systems were marvels of observation and mathematics. The builders of these structures had to understand topography deeply. They had to be able to look at a landscape and imagine where water from a spring in the distant hills could flow if guided properly, what route would be most efficient, where the water would need to be channeled and where it could be allowed to flow more openly. The Spanish conquistadors and the missionaries who came after them were astounded by the scale of these water engineering projects when they finally encountered them. They saw aqueducts that rivaled anything in Europe, channels that had been functioning for centuries, water management systems that suggested a level of organization, and technical knowledge that challenged their assumptions about the people they had conquered. Some of the aqueducts built to bring water from these natural springs would continue to function for centuries after the city had been abandoned, continuing to deliver water into the colonial period and beyond. Today, even as modern Mexico City and its sprawling metropolitan area draw water from sources many kilometers away, using mechanical pumps and modern technology, some of the water that flows through pipes in this region still follows routes established by the Teotihuacanos over 1,500 years ago. If you're still awake and enjoying this, consider subscribing to the Calm Archive. A like really does help more people find these videos when they can't sleep. Now let's get back to the water beneath Teotihuacan and explore the most critical application of all this engineering knowledge. Feeding a population of 200,000 people in a landscape that seemed incapable of supporting such abundance. The agricultural system that sustained Teotihuacan was as sophisticated as the water engineering that made it possible. and the two systems were deeply intertwined. The surrounding valley was not naturally fertile. The volcanic soil, while rich in minerals, was not automatically abundant in the organic matter that crops need to thrive. But when water from the San Juan River was channeled into agricultural fields, when rainfall was captured and directed where it was needed, when the natural springs of the surrounding hills could be counted upon to provide regular irrigation, the valley transformed. Crops flourished in ways that would have seemed impossible in the dry environment of central Mexico. The Teotihuacanos developed a form of intensive agriculture that was not identical to the Chinampas, the famous raised beds that would later be built throughout the lakes of the Valley of Mexico, but which shared many of the same principles. Fields were organized into plots that could be irrigated systematically. Canals ran between these plots, supplying water on a regular schedule that the farmers had learned through generations of experimentation. The crops grown were primarily maize, beans, and amaranth, staple crops that provided the calories necessary to sustain the city's enormous population. The engineering of the agricultural irrigation system reveals a level of coordination and central planning that speaks to the sophistication of Teotihuacan's government and administrative structure. Individual farmers did not simply decide on their own how to irrigate their fields. Instead, there was a master plan for how water would be distributed, when different fields would receive water, how the flow would be managed to ensure that as many plots as possible received optimal irrigation. This required record-keeping, planning, and the authority to enforce these plans. It required administrators who understood the relationship between water flow, crop yields, and population capacity. It required the ability to make decisions that sometimes favored one group of farmers over another, and to have those decisions accepted because they served the greater good of the city as a whole. Archaeological evidence suggests that there were officials responsible for water distribution, that disputes over water rights were adjudicated by the governing authorities, that the water system was not a free-for-all, but rather a carefully managed common resource. The seasonal rhythm of the water system shaped the rhythms of life in Teotihuacan. The city's farmers worked in concert with the monsoon rains that dominated the climate of central Mexico. During the rainy season, from May through October, the reservoirs filled, the springs flowed abundantly, and the San Juan River swelled with water. This was the season of growth, when fields were flooded with irrigation water, when crops grew rapidly, when the city's storehouses were filled with the harvest. Then came the dry season, from November through April. The rain stopped. The rivers slowed to a trickle, but the reservoirs that had been filled during the wet season still held water. The springs, fed by groundwater, continued to flow. The aqueducts continued to deliver water from the distant hills. The irrigation system continued to function, though at a reduced level. Some fields lay fallow during this period. Others received water from the reservoirs, allowing for a secondary harvest or the cultivation of crops that required less water. The entire system was designed to smooth out the extremes of the climate, to store abundance for the season of scarcity, to ensure that the city and its population could be fed year-round. This regularization of the water supply made possible something that was almost unprecedented in the ancient Mesoamerican world, the sustained growth of a huge urban population. Most pre-Columbian cities in Mesoamerica depended on maize agriculture, and maize agriculture depended on reliable rainfall. When the rains failed, crops failed. When crops failed, people starved. Famines were part of the rhythm of life. But Teotihuacan, through its water engineering, had largely mitigated this risk. Even in years when rainfall was below normal, the reservoir system and the aqueducts ensured that crops could be irrigated. Even in severe droughts, the springs would continue to flow. This stability, this dependable food supply, allowed the city to grow far beyond what would have been possible in a rain-dependent agricultural system. It allowed for the accumulation of surplus production, the specialization of labor, the emergence of merchants, craftspeople, priests, and administrators who did not themselves farm, but who could be sustained by the surplus production of others. The water system also enabled the existence of large-scale public works projects and monumental architecture. The construction of the Pyramid of the Sun, the Pyramid of the Moon, the vast temple complexes and residential areas that characterized Teotihuacan required the sustained labor of thousands of workers. These workers had to be fed. The existence of a reliable food supply, made possible by sophisticated water management, meant that society could support large classes of people who were not engaged in farming. Workers could be drafted or conscripted to build monuments because their food was assured, because the agricultural system could produce enough surplus to feed both themselves and the labourers. This was the foundation upon which Teotihuacan's spectacular achievements rested. Not magic, not forced labour alone, but the practical matter of being able to feed a large population reliably. The sophistication of Teotihuacan's water management system becomes even more remarkable when you consider the tools available to the builders. There was no iron, no steel, no machinery beyond the lever and the pulley. The Teotihuacanos had stone tools and wooden implements. They did not have surveying instruments of the kind that would later be developed in Europe. Yet they engineered systems of water delivery and management that would rival anything constructed in the ancient world. How did they do it? Through observation, through mathematics, through generations of accumulated knowledge. A builder with a simple wooden straight edge and a water-filled tube could determine if a channel was level. By watching how water flowed, by understanding the relationship between slope and flow rate, a master engineer could design an aqueduct that would deliver water from a spring many kilometres away and ensure that it arrived in the city with enough pressure to be useful, but not so much that it would damage the channels that contained it. The comparison between Teotihuacan's water engineering and modern systems is instructive and perhaps humbling. In the 21st century, with all of our technology, our pumps and our pipes and our computers, cities still struggle with water management. We still build reservoirs that silt up, still suffer from droughts and floods, still make decisions that squander water resources. The Valley of Mexico today is in a profound water crisis. Mexico City, which sprawls across the same landscape where Teotihuacan once stood, is sinking because the aquifer beneath it is being drained faster than it can recharge. Water has to be pumped in from hundreds of kilometres away, at enormous energetic and financial cost. Yet the Teotihuacanos, with their stone channels and their careful engineering, managed a city of 200,000 people in this same landscape without exhausting the water resources available to them. They understood something that modern urban planners have often forgotten, that water is not an unlimited resource, that the demand for water must be balanced against the supply, that overexploitation of water sources leads to catastrophe. The Teotihuacanos achieved a kind of water equilibrium, a sustainable relationship with their environment that allowed them to sustain a great city for centuries. What exactly happened to this sophisticated system? The city of Teotihuacan, after flourishing for nearly 800 years, began to decline around the 8th century. The precise causes remain mysterious and debated among archaeologists. Some scholars point to resource depletion, the idea that the very agricultural intensity that had made the city possible eventually exhausted the soil or depleted the water sources that fed the system. Others suggest climate change, a shift in rainfall patterns in central Mexico that made the dry season even drier, that pushed the climate toward aridity in ways that even Teotihuacan's sophisticated water system could not overcome. Others point to political upheaval, to the idea that the rigid hierarchical system that managed the city and its resources broke down, that the careful administration of water rights and agricultural production collapsed into chaos and competition. Most likely, the answer is complex, a combination of factors that each placed stress on the system, that together eventually became unsustainable. But the water engineering itself was not the failure. The system itself was sound. What failed was the ability to maintain it, to manage it, to defend it as the wider world changed. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Valley of Mexico in the 16th century, Teotihuacan was already a ruin, though its pyramids still dominated the landscape. The city had been abandoned centuries earlier. Its water channels had fallen into disrepair. The reservoirs had silted up or drained away. The aqueducts no longer delivered water from the distant hills, yet the evidence of its water system remained visible to anyone who looked carefully. In subsequent centuries, as the Spanish built Mexico City, as they drained the lakes of the Valley of Mexico and transformed the landscape, they often made use of the aqueducts and channels left behind by the Teotihuacanos. It was easier to repair an ancient aqueduct than to build a new one, easier to follow a channel already cut into the stone than to chart an entirely new course. In this way, the water engineering of Teotihuacan continued to shape the landscape and support human life long after the city itself had vanished. The great city that had fed 200,000 people with no river, with a river that it had learned to divert and redirect and manage, had built something that outlasted even its own collapse, It had built a system that would continue to serve the region for centuries to come, a monument to the ingenuity and determination of an ancient people who had looked at their landscape and decided that it could be transformed to meet their needs. The water beneath Teotihuacan had made all of this possible. Not just the monuments and the temples, but a vision of what human civilization could achieve when it married engineering knowledge with determination and will. Imagine stepping into the year 250 of our Common Era. The autumn sun hangs low over the basin of Mexico, casting the light of late afternoon across the most magnificent city the world has yet seen north of Rome. You stand at the southern edge of what the Spanish conquistadors would later call the Avenue of the Dead, though the Teotihuacans had their own name for this vast ceremonial pathway, a name now lost to time, spoken only in the whispers of wind through ancient stones. Before you stretches a sight that would take your breath away, even knowing it was coming. The avenue extends for 2.5 kilometers, nearly 1.5 miles, stretching northward in a perfectly straight line, so precise, so intentional, that it seems less like a path created by human hands and more like a scar drawn across the earth by the gods themselves. The avenue is 40 meters wide, approximately 130 feet, wide enough that 4 modern cars could drive side by side with space to spare, and it is lined on either side with massive pyramidal structures, platforms and temples that rise in ascending tiers toward the sky. The scale of it all is almost incomprehensible. You're standing in a city that houses somewhere between 150,000 and 250,000 people. The estimates vary, but whatever the precise number, it is a metropolis that rivals Rome in size during the same period, far larger than London, Paris, or any significant European city of the age. Area of roughly 21 square kilometers, about 8 square miles, but it is not sprawling and loose like some modern cities. It is tightly organized, carefully planned, almost grid-like in its precision, with residential compounds and apartment buildings packed efficiently throughout. This is not a city that grew haphazardly over centuries. This is a city that was consciously designed, built according to a master plan, and continuously refined over generations. The civilization that created Teotihuacan engineered this urban landscape with an intentionality and sophistication that should make us pause. They had vision. They had the capacity to plan at a massive scale and execute that plan across generations, and most astonishingly, they did it without a written language that has survived to our time, without the wheel, without draft animals, without any of the technological advantages that we might assume necessary for such an undertaking. As you walk slowly northward down the avenue, your eyes are drawn repeatedly upward. The structures that line this grand processional way are not small. They are substantial pyramids, each of them representing centuries of labour and devotion. These are not dwellings or administrative buildings, or rather, they are not mere dwellings or administrative buildings. They are spiritual monuments, sacred spaces where the inhabitants of Teotihuacan connected with their gods and performed rituals of profound importance. The avenue itself was a stage upon which the most important ceremonies of the city were performed. Imagine processions moving slowly down this stone pathway during festival times, perhaps during the great ceremonies that mark the changes of seasons or important astronomical events. Imagine the sounds, the beat of drums, the blow of conch shell trumpets, the chanting of priests and the murmuring of thousands of people watching from the plazas. The avenue is shaded periodically by vegetation and by the shadows of the structures flanking it, and as the afternoon light shifts, patterns of light and shadow dance across the stone beneath your feet. You notice that the surface is well maintained, regularly swept, and the stones that make up the pavement are carefully placed. There is something almost meditative about walking on these stones, knowing that millions of human feet have walked on this same pathway, that thousands of ceremonies have unfolded here, that this has been the beating heart of a civilization for centuries. But your gaze cannot remain earthbound for long, because at the northern end of the avenue, dominating the landscape absolutely, rises the Pyramid of the Moon. It is not the largest pyramid in Teotihuacan. That distinction belongs to the Pyramid of the Sun, which you passed earlier in your journey down the avenue. But it is the most perfectly proportioned, the most artfully placed, and in many ways it commands the space more completely than any other structure. The Pyramid of the Moon is approximately 43 meters tall, about 140 feet, and it is positioned so that it sits directly in line with a mountain behind it, called Cerro Gordo, the Big Hill. This is no accident. The alignment is intentional and represents a principle that was fundamental to Teotihuacan's architecture and worldview: the connection between the built environment and the natural landscape, between human structures and the cosmic order. The pyramid appears to merge with the mountain behind it, creating a composite form that rises majestically against the sky. The pyramid is composed of multiple superimposed platforms, each one stepping back as it rises, creating a visual rhythm that your eye follows upward. The surfaces are painted in bright colours, reds and yellows that have faded over time, but in this imagined moment of historical peak, they would have been vivid and striking, visible from great distances across the city. As the sun descends toward the western horizon, the light catches these painted surfaces, and the pyramid seems to glow with an inner warmth, as if the structure itself is alive, as if it is breathing with the rhythms of the cosmos. Walking down the Avenue of the Dead in the late afternoon, as shadows lengthen and the angle of the light shifts moment by moment, is to experience something approaching transcendence. Your feet carry you forward on the ancient stone pathway, and your mind begins to settle into a slower rhythm. The grandeur of the architecture, the careful planning evident in every aspect of the cityscape, the sheer number of people who have walked this path before you, all of it combines to create a sense of humility and wonder. The city is vast, but also somehow intimate. Yes, there are 200,000 people living here, but they are not faceless masses. They are individuals with families, with professions, with skills and knowledge and dreams. They are weavers and stonemasons, priests and traders, farmers and artists, children playing in courtyards and elders remembering the teachings of their ancestors. The architecture impresses with its scale, but it is the humanity contained within it that gives the scale its meaning. Now let us turn our attention to the structure that perhaps more than any other symbolizes the ingenuity and ambition of Teotihuacan's architects and builders: the Pyramid of the Sun. Walking southward from the Avenue of the Dead, you approach this extraordinary monument, and as you get closer, your sense of scale begins to shift. The Pyramid of the Sun is enormous. It is 65 meters tall, approximately 114 feet, which means it is taller than a 20-story building. It covers a base area of about 225 meters on each side, making it approximately 735 feet on each edge. The total volume of material contained within this structure is estimated at more than 1 million cubic meters. To put that in perspective, the Great Pyramid of Giza, built more than 2,000 years earlier, is larger in overall volume, but the Pyramid of the Sun is an achievement of comparable magnitude, all the more remarkable given the technological constraints of its builders. The pyramid was constructed without any metal tools more sophisticated than copper. It was built without the wheel. It was built by human beings moving stone and earth using human power alone, directing and organizing that power through religious and social structures that could motivate and maintain focus across generations. The pyramid rises in 4 distinct tiers or stages, each one stepping inward as it rises, creating a geometric form that is visually striking and structurally sound. The surfaces of these tiers are decorated with carved stone elements and were originally covered with painted plaster, creating visual patterns that caught the light and shifted as you moved around the structure. But the most remarkable feature of the Pyramid of the Sun is not visible from the outside. Archaeologists discovered that the pyramid was built over a massive cave system beneath its surface. This cave is natural, formed by geological processes over millennia, but the Teotihuacans recognized its spiritual significance and built their greatest monument directly above it. The cave extends back into the earth for at least 100 meters and contains multiple chambers. The entrance to the cave is aligned with the central axis of the pyramid, suggesting that this alignment was intentional, that the builders wanted the sacred space within the earth to be honored and marked by the sacred space that rises above it. Some scholars believe that the pyramid may have been intended to represent a cosmic axis, with the cave below representing the underworld and the pyramid above representing the realms of heaven and divine power. The entire structure then becomes a cosmological statement, a 3-dimensional representation of the universe as the Teotihuacans understood it. The construction of the Pyramid of the Sun was a massive undertaking. It required the quarrying and transport of massive amounts of stone, the moving of that stone to the site, the careful organization of hundreds or even thousands of workers over the course of many decades. Modern archaeologists estimate that it would have taken several thousand workers over several years to complete the initial construction, and then additional centuries of maintenance, refinement, and ritual use. At its peak, the pyramid would have been staffed with priests, swept clean daily, painted and maintained, used as the stage for important ceremonies and astronomical observations. Standing before the Pyramid of the Sun at sunset with the lower tiers already in shadow, and the upper platform still catching the golden light of the descending sun, you understand why this structure was sacred. You understand why people would spend their entire lives in its service, why they would view its construction and maintenance as their highest calling. To the southeast of the Pyramid of the Sun, occupying a position along the Avenue of the Dead, stands another monument of profound importance, the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, known in the Aztec language as the Temple of Quetzalcoatl. This structure is smaller in volume than the Pyramid of the Sun, but it is in many ways more intricate, more detailed, more accomplished in terms of sculptural and architectural artistry. The temple is a four-tiered pyramid, approximately 22 meters tall, but every surface is covered with carved stone sculptures and architectural elements. The faces of the pyramid are decorated with enormous carved heads representing the feathered serpent deity, Quetzalcoatl, and other serpentine forms. These carvings are executed with remarkable precision and detail. The serpents undulate across the surfaces of the pyramid, their bodies articulated with individual scales, their mouths open in expressions that seem almost alive. Between the serpent motifs are shells and other marine imagery, suggesting connections to water, fertility, and the cosmic waters from which all life emerges. The interior of the Temple of the Feathered Serpent contains a series of chambers and passages, and beneath the structure, archaeologists have discovered evidence of extensive burial practices and ritual offerings. Hundreds of individuals were interred beneath and within this temple, some of them showing signs of having been sacrificed in dedication ceremonies. The offerings found include obsidian blades, seashells, marine mammal remains, and sculptures. The presence of these offerings tells us something important about how the Teotihuacans understood their relationship with the sacred. The construction of a new temple, the dedication of a sacred space, was marked by offerings and sometimes by human sacrifice. These were not acts of casual violence or cruelty, but rather formalized religious rituals in which individuals, sometimes captives, sometimes possibly volunteers, were ritually killed as a way of honoring and empowering the sacred space being created. The boundary between the world of the living and the world of the divine was thought to be permeable, and through sacrifice, that boundary could be negotiated and strengthened. The appearance of the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, with its ornate carvings and symbolic imagery, reflects a different kind of architecture than the more austere and geometric forms of the other major pyramids. Here, the emphasis is on decoration, on symbolic communication through carved imagery. This temple was a statement about the importance of the feathered serpent deity in Teotihuacan religious thought, and, some scholars believe, a monument built by or for a particular ruler or dynasty. The presence of high-status burials beneath the temple suggests that this was the mausoleum of important individuals as well as a temple dedicated to the deity. Moving away from the great ceremonial structures and toward the residential areas of the city, the architecture changes dramatically. Teotihuacan is famous in archaeological circles for its standardized residential compounds, and with good reason. These compounds represent a unique approach to urban living that is found nowhere else in the ancient world. Unlike the haphazard growth of most pre-modern cities, Teotihuacan's residential areas follow a grid pattern with compounds arranged in regular blocks. These compounds are typically rectangular, with walls on all four sides accessed by a single entrance and arranged around a central courtyard. Multiple families lived in each compound, perhaps 10 to 15 people on average, though the compounds varied in size and number of residents. The compounds were not luxurious, but neither were they crude. The walls were plastered and painted. The floors were carefully laid. The central courtyards contained shrines and platforms that were used for religious observance and for communal activities. Water was collected in basins and channels, and the compounds had systems for managing water runoff and waste. Living in these compounds would have meant existing in close proximity to your extended family and neighbours, with limited privacy but also with strong communal bonds. The daily rhythms of life would have been punctuated by collective activities, shared meals, participation in religious observances, work at shared crafts or in collective labour. The compounds were organised by craft specialisation. Archaeological evidence shows that entire blocks of compounds were occupied by people engaged in the same craft. There were obsidian working compounds, where residents spent their days chipping and shaping volcanic glass into sharp blades and points for export throughout Mesoamerica. There were pottery-making compounds, where clay was shaped into vessels of every conceivable size and function. There were compounds where people worked with jade, bone and stone, creating sculpted ornaments and ritual objects. There were compounds where people engaged in food preparation and storage. This organisation by craft represents a sophisticated understanding of how to structure an urban economy. Instead of spreading craftspeople throughout the city, mixing them randomly with farmers and merchants, the city's planners grouped specialists together, allowing for the sharing of knowledge, tools and raw materials, and creating centres of expertise and production. The marketplace of Teotihuacan was likely located in the great open plaza south of the Pyramid of the Sun, an enormous flat space that could accommodate thousands of people. We can imagine merchants from across the city and from surrounding regions gathering here on market days, spreading their wares on mats and in temporary stalls. The obsidian that was central to Teotihuacan's economy and power was traded here, along with pottery, textiles, jade, cacao, amaranth, beans, maize, and countless other goods. Evidence suggests that Teotihuacan traders maintained networks that extended across the entire Mesoamerican world. Teotihuacan obsidian has been found in archaeological sites hundreds of kilometers away. Teotihuacan merchants may have traveled to the Maya cities of the south, to the civilization developing on the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, to the peoples of the north. They may have established trading posts in distant cities, may have lived abroad for extended periods, may have created a vast web of economic relationships that made Teotihuacan the centre of commerce for the ancient Mesoamerican world. The marketplace would have been a place of sensory richness. The smell of exotic foods being prepared, the cacophony of voices speaking different dialects and languages, the sight of goods piled high and artfully displayed, the vibrant colours of textiles and painted pottery. The marketplace was where different peoples met and mingled, where information about distant events and distant places was exchanged along with goods. For the ordinary inhabitant of Teotihuacan, the marketplace was one of the few places where the true scale and reach of their civilization could be perceived. Standing in the marketplace, you could see evidence of trade with peoples you had never met, goods from regions you might never visit, craftspeople representing different specialties and different regions. The visual environment of Teotihuacan at its peak would have been transformed by the presence of mural paintings. Nearly every public surface and many private surfaces were covered with painted decoration. These murals ranged from simple geometric patterns to complex scenes of profound spiritual significance. Many of the murals depicted water in all its forms: streams, rivers, fountains, rain. Water symbolism was everywhere, reflecting the fundamental importance of water to the survival of the city and to the spiritual worldview of its inhabitants. Other murals depicted the natural world: birds, butterflies, jaguars, mountain lions, serpents, rendered with remarkable naturalism and artistic skill. Some murals showed elaborate ritual scenes, with priests or deities depicted engaging in ceremonies. Others showed more intimate scenes of daily life, or paradisiacal landscapes where water flowed abundantly, where plants grew in profusion, where human beings lived in harmony with nature and the divine. The most famous of these murals, found in compounds throughout the city, is often called the Paradise of Tlaloc, depicting a scene of paradise under the patronage of Tlaloc, the god of rain and water. In these murals, human figures are shown playing and dancing in a landscape of abundance, with water flowing from numerous sources, with plants and flowers in bloom, with butterflies and birds visible throughout. The figures in the murals appear happy, even ecstatic, playing musical instruments, enjoying fruits and flowers, living in a state of harmony and abundance. For the inhabitants of Teotihuacan, these murals were visual expressions of a religious hope, that through proper worship, through the appropriate performance of rituals and ceremonies, they could help maintain the cosmic order and ensure that rain would fall, that water would flow, that the land would remain fertile. The murals were religious teachings, visual mantras that reinforced theological concepts every time someone viewed them. The painted surfaces of Teotihuacan would have created a visual environment of extraordinary richness and complexity. Reds and yellows, blues and blacks, greens and purples would have covered the walls of temples and compounds. In sunlight, these colours would have been vivid and striking. In shadow, they would have created more muted, contemplative effects. The painting technique used lime plaster, and the painters worked with remarkable speed and skill, often creating complex scenes with astonishing detail. The pigments were made from natural mineral sources, ochre, charcoal, indigo, and other materials, combined with binding agents to create paints that have remained vibrant even after more than 1,500 years of exposure to the elements. The skill level evident in these murals indicates that painting was a valued craft, practiced by trained specialists who spent years learning their art and who created works of extraordinary beauty and sophistication. Imagine now that it is approaching dusk, as the sun sinks lower toward the western horizon and the quality of light begins to shift toward the golden tones of late afternoon. Imagine yourself standing once again at the southern end of the Avenue of the Dead, having walked the entire length of the avenue from the Pyramid of the Sun through the residential compounds and marketplaces to the open plazas and great ceremonial structures at the northern end. You are ready to walk the avenue in the opposite direction now from north to south, as the light of the day transitions toward evening. The avenue is beginning to empty, as people complete their business and begin moving toward their homes and their evening meals. The priests and temple attendants may still be visible on the steps of the pyramids, making final adjustments to ritual arrangements or maintaining the sacred spaces. But for the most part, the avenue is yours to walk at a slower, more contemplative pace. You move southward, and with each step the light shifts. The pyramid of the moon behind you gradually fades into shadow, even as the pyramid of the sun ahead of you begins to catch the last light of the day in a particular way that makes its planes and surfaces seem to glow. The pathway beneath your feet transitions from bright sunlit stone to areas of deep shadow cast by the surrounding structures. The shadows of the pyramids stretch long across the avenue, and you walk through these zones of diminishing light, your senses becoming more acute as the light fades. You notice the subtle temperature changes. Areas of shade are cooler than areas still receiving direct sunlight. You notice the particular quality of the air in these shadowed spaces, perhaps slightly cooler, perhaps carrying faint aromas from the cooking fires and kitchen areas of nearby residential compounds. The sound environment shifts as well. The marketplace crowd has thinned, so the constant hum of many voices has been replaced by smaller conversations, by the sound of footsteps on stone, by wind moving through the spaces between structures. You move deeper into a meditative state, and the grandeur of the avenue no longer feels overwhelming but rather supportive and embracing. The massive pyramids that line your path seem to be guardian presences, and the carved decorations on the temple facades seem to watch your passage with something approaching kindness. The ancestors and spirits associated with these structures seem to acknowledge your presence, to welcome your respect and attention. With each step, you feel your breathing deepen, your muscles relax, your mind settle into a state of peace. The worries and concerns of your daily life seem to fade into insignificance against the backdrop of this ancient city, with its long history, its spiritual depth, its connection to cosmic rhythms and divine purpose. You're a single human being, small and temporary, walking among stones that have existed for more than 15 centuries and will exist for many more centuries to come. Your individual anxieties matter less in this context. Your connection to something larger than yourself, to the long continuity of human civilization and spiritual seeking, becomes more palpable. The avenue seems to extend forward and backward in time simultaneously, and you are aware of countless people who have walked this same path throughout its history. Priests conducting ceremonies, citizens witnessing spectacles, traders carrying goods, ordinary people going about ordinary business. You are connected to all of them across time, and they are connected to you through the shared human experience of moving through sacred space, of seeking meaning and connection with something beyond the everyday. The Teotihuacan at its peak represented the culmination of centuries of development and growth. The city was achieving its maximum population and spatial extent. The systems that allowed it to feed more people than could be supported in any city previously known to the world were functioning at their optimum. The religious practices and ceremonies that gave meaning and cohesion to the society were being performed in the magnificent temples and on the Grand Avenue. The artistic and intellectual achievements of the civilization were being expressed in sculpture, in painting, in the architecture of the city itself. At the same time, though we cannot perceive it from within this moment, the peak of Teotihuacan's power contained within it the seeds of its eventual decline. The environmental systems that supported the city were beginning to show signs of stress. The deforestation that had been necessary to clear land for agriculture and to provide wood for construction and cooking fires was accelerating. The soil that had been carefully managed to remain fertile was beginning to show signs of degradation. The population was continuing to grow, and the pressure on food supplies was increasing. But in the year 250 CE, in the year 300 CE, in the year 400 CE, these problems were not yet catastrophic. The city was still growing, still achieving, still inspiring awe and devotion from its inhabitants, and fear and respect from its neighbours. The Pyramid of the Sun still stood as the greatest monument to human ambition and divine connection that the world had yet seen. The Avenue of the Dead still functioned as the sacred centre of a great civilization. The murals still proclaimed messages of hope and paradisiacal abundance. The obsidian still flowed out along trade routes to distant lands, carrying with it the reputation and influence of Teotihuacan. For now, in this moment of peak achievement, the city was one of the great centres of the world, a place where human civilization had reached remarkable heights, where the relationship between human beings and their environment was being negotiated and sustained through engineering, planning, organisation, and faith. The story of Teotihuacan at its height is the story of human potential, of what can be achieved through collective effort, shared vision, and organised labour. It is a story that merits our attention, our reflection, and our wonder. As we drift deeper into the story of Teotihuacan, we encounter something that should comfort us in the darkness of night, a profound mystery. You see, for all the pyramids we've walked through, for all the streets we've traced, for all the engineering marvels we've uncovered, there remains something fundamentally unknowable about this city. And perhaps that's where the real magic lives. Not in the answers we've found, but in the questions that still linger after 1,500 years of abandonment and 500 years of modern study. There is something deeply peaceful about approaching these mysteries, because they remind us that some things in this world resist simple explanation. They humble us. They invite us to sit with wonder rather than reach for certainty. Let's begin with the most fundamental mystery of all, one that might seem simple on the surface but grows more complex the longer you contemplate it. We do not know what the people of Teotihuacan called themselves. We do not know what they called their city. The name Teotihuacan itself was given to this place centuries after it was abandoned, when the Aztecs wandered through its ruins in the 1400s and marvelled at what they found. The Aztecs, who built their own extraordinary city on the ruins of previous civilizations, stood before these monuments and were overwhelmed with the sense of the sacred and the divine. They believed that what they were looking at could only be explained by the presence of gods, so they named it Teotihuacan, which means the place where the gods were created, or sometimes translated as the birthplace of the gods. It's a name rooted in reverence and mystery, but it tells us nothing about how the actual inhabitants of this great metropolis understood themselves or their home. Imagine for a moment the weight of that unknowing. Imagine walking through a city of 200,000 people, understanding their architecture, their agriculture, their trade routes, their religious beliefs, and yet being unable to call them by their own names. The people who built the Pyramid of the Sun, who engineered the Citadel, who created one of the world's greatest urban centres during the height of the classical period, they remain anonymous to us. Historians have proposed various names over the decades. Some have suggested they might have been the Totonacs, based on linguistic and cultural continuity in the region after Teotihuacan's fall. Others have wondered if perhaps we're dealing with a mixture of different peoples who came together to form this unified civilization. But these are educated guesses, careful inferences based on fragmentary evidence. We simply don't know, and that absence of knowledge is humbling. The people of Teotihuacan left us their buildings, their art, their ceramic vessels, the arrangement of their streets, the bones of their dead. But they left us something crucial. They left us no writing. Or rather, they left very little writing, and what little they did leave we cannot read. Teotihuacan is one of the only major civilizations in human history to achieve such monumental scale and complexity without producing a deciphered writing system. Think about that as you're falling asleep tonight. Every other great Mesoamerican civilization, the Maya, the Zapotec, the Mixtec, left us inscribed records. Some of those records are still being deciphered, but we've made genuine progress with Maya glyphs. We can read dates, names, royal lineages, the exploits of kings. But Teotihuacan resists this kind of understanding. There are certainly signs and symbols throughout the city, in the murals, on pottery, in the layout of buildings. But if these constitute a true writing system, we have not yet found the Rosetta Stone that would unlock it. What might Teotihuacanos have written if they possessed writing as we understand it? Would they have recorded the history of their city's founding, the names of their leaders, the reasons for their astronomical alignments, the purpose of the mysterious chambers we're about to discuss? These questions haunt us, and they haunt the archaeologists who spend their careers trying to piece together the life of this silent city. The absence of writing is not perhaps a deficiency. Some scholars have suggested that Teotihuacan may have relied on oral tradition, on memorized knowledge passed from elder to younger, on stories told around fires much like the ones that might accompany you as you listen to this very narrative. There is something sacred, something ancient about knowledge that lives in sound and memory rather than in carved stone or written paper. And yet we cannot help but wonder what has been lost. This uncertainty extends to the question of how Teotihuacan was governed. In every other Mesoamerican civilization we study, there are rulers. There are kings whose names we know, whose images we can see carved into stone or painted on ceramic vessels. The great Mayan sites like Tikal and Copan are organized around the tombs and monuments of their rulers. The Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan was a state centered on the authority of a single emperor. But Teotihuacan presents something different, something that archaeologists are still struggling to understand. There are no depictions of individual rulers in Teotihuacan's art. There are no royal tombs with names carved beside the honored dead. There are no dynastic records, no lists of succession, no monuments erected by a king celebrating his own deeds. In all of Mesoamerica, this is remarkable, almost unprecedented. So who held power in Teotihuacan? The answer, we increasingly believe, may be more complex than a simple monarchy. Some scholars have proposed that the city was ruled by a council of priests or nobles, a kind of collective governance where religious and political authority was distributed among several individuals or families. Others have suggested that the true power might have rested with the priesthood, that the priests who interpreted the movements of the stars, who performed the rituals that kept the cosmos in balance, who guided the spiritual life of the city, were the genuine authorities. Still others wonder if perhaps Teotihuacan represents something even more unusual, a city where authority was so thoroughly embedded in the system itself, in the layout of the streets, in the grand buildings that embodied collective purpose, that individual rulers were simply unnecessary. Perhaps the city was the ruler. Perhaps the order itself was enough. This mystery becomes even deeper when we consider the implications. A city of 200,000 people, sustained for 6 centuries, one of the largest cities in the world during its time, and yet apparently without a dominant ruler figure who demanded monuments to his own glory, or sought to immortalize his name and deeds. There is something almost modern about this, something that speaks to a different understanding of power and authority. Or perhaps it speaks to a different understanding of divinity, where the sacred was so thoroughly woven into every aspect of city life that no single human could claim dominion over it. What kind of society creates such an arrangement? What kind of collective consciousness must have animated the people of Teotihuacan to allow such a system to flourish? These are the questions that can drift through your mind as you settle deeper into sleep. Questions without easy answers. Questions that invite contemplation rather than demand it. Beneath the temple of the feathered serpent lies another mystery, one that was hidden for 18 centuries. In 2003, archaeologists using remote sensing technology discovered a tunnel system that had been deliberately sealed, intentionally hidden away, sometime around 1300 years ago. As you imagine the excavation of this tunnel, picture it with us. The careful work, the holding of breath, the light of flashlights penetrating into a chamber that had been closed since the fall of Teotihuacan's great civilization. What they found inside transformed our understanding of the religious life of this city. The chambers were filled with offerings, thousands upon thousands of offerings, carefully arranged, left as gifts to the sacred world. There were pyrite mirrors, their surfaces polished to a gleaming brightness, capable of reflecting light and creating the impression of water, of sky, of cosmic significance. Why leave mirrors in a sealed chamber? What did they represent to the people who placed them there? Were they meant to reflect the divine light into the underworld? Were they meant to allow the sacred beings below to see into the world above? Pyrite was a precious material, valuable and difficult to work with, and yet the people of Teotihuacan left thousands of these mirrors in darkness in a chamber that would never be seen again. There is something almost incomprehensibly devout about that act, something that speaks to a kind of faith and commitment that is hard for us to fathom in our modern age. Alongside the mirrors lay greenstone figures, jade and other green stones carved into the shapes of beings, perhaps jaguars, perhaps deities, perhaps representations of the spiritual forces that the people believed inhabited the world. These green stones came from great distances, traded along routes that connected Teotihuacan to other civilizations across Mesoamerica. They were precious, valuable, the kinds of things that a city might hoard and protect, and yet they were placed in a sealed chamber, given to the earth and to the sacred, with the full knowledge that human eyes would not see them again. There is a generosity in that gesture, a willingness to give away the most precious things, to acknowledge that something greater than human desire exists in this world. But perhaps the most haunting discovery in those sealed chambers was the presence of liquid mercury. Pools of it, carefully arranged, meant to represent sacred water, meant to represent the supernatural realm. Mercury is a strange element, a liquid metal that moves and flows, that reflects light, that seems to belong to neither the world of solids nor the world of liquids. To the people of Teotihuacan, it may have represented something even more mysterious, a tangible connection to the sacred, to the waters that flowed through the underworld, to the cosmological model in which the city itself existed. Where did this mercury come from? Mexico does have natural sources of mercury in its mineral deposits, but it is not abundant, not easy to obtain. The effort required to gather this liquid metal, to transport it, to place it in a sealed chamber beneath a great temple, all of this speaks to a profound commitment to sacred purpose, a willingness to expend great resources on things that were never intended to be seen or used by the living. We can only imagine the ceremonies that might have accompanied the sealing of these chambers. Was there a gathering of priests, a procession of pilgrims, a moment of collective intention as the entrance was sealed, as the offerings were surrendered to the earth? Did the people of Teotihuacan understand that they were entrusting something sacred to the future, making an offering that only the gods could witness? The tunnel and its chambers remind us that Teotihuacan was not just a city of material achievement, of clever engineering and successful agriculture. It was a city of deep spiritual commitment, a place where the sacred and the everyday were woven together so completely that they could not be separated. As we consider the city's relationship with the cosmos, we encounter yet another mystery, the astronomical alignments that govern the very structure of Teotihuacan. The city was not built on a grid that aligns with cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. Instead, the entire urban plan is rotated approximately 15.5 degrees to the east of north. This is not a random quirk of geography or an accident of construction. The rotation is deliberate, consistent, and so precisely executed that it could not be accidental. But what was the city aligned to? For decades, archaeologists puzzled over this question, and the answer, when it emerged, revealed something profound about how the people of Teotihuacan understood the heavens. The city is aligned with the Pleiades star cluster, that beautiful group of stars, those seven sisters of ancient mythology, those points of light that have guided travellers and inspired poets for thousands of years. Specifically, Teotihuacan is oriented toward the point where the Pleiades set on the western horizon. The Pleiades were significant to many Mesoamerican cultures, but at Teotihuacan they were so important that they determined the orientation of an entire city. The streets run toward where these stars disappear each night. The Great Pyramids stand as monuments to this celestial alignment. The city itself became a mirror of the heavens, with roads and buildings positioned according to the movements of distant suns, arranged according to a cosmic order that transcended human understanding. Imagine standing in the ancient city and understanding that every street you walked, every building you entered, every orientation of your daily life was calibrated according to the movements of these stars. The Pleiades rise and set in specific locations according to the season, and the city captures this movement in stone and earth. You cannot help but feel small in the face of such astronomical knowledge and such cosmic commitment. The people of Teotihuacan were not merely building a city, They were building a terrestrial representation of the heavens, a sacred space where the patterns of the cosmos could be honored and celebrated in the very fabric of human habitation. This alignment speaks to a deep understanding of astronomy, a long history of observation and recording, a culture that placed the movements of the stars at the very center of its identity. There is another mystery, one that defies easy explanation, and that speaks to the ingenuity and perhaps the peculiarity of Teotihuacan's builders. Throughout certain buildings in the city, particularly in structures of apparent religious significance, archaeologists have discovered sheets of mica, thin, translucent layers of this mineral embedded into the floors. Mica came from very far away, from sources in what is now Brazil, literally thousands of kilometers to the south and east. The effort required to obtain this material, to transport it across such vast distances, to incorporate it into the architecture of the city, must have been extraordinary. What purpose could it possibly serve? Mica has no structural value in a building. It does not strengthen walls or provide support. It is not suitable for tools or weapons. It cannot be eaten or made into cloth. From a purely practical standpoint, mica is nearly useless, and yet the people of Teotihuacan valued it enough to import it from distant lands, enough to work it into the very floors of important buildings. The most likely explanation is that mica held some spiritual or symbolic significance. Perhaps its translucent quality fascinated them, allowing light to pass through in ways that solid stone could not. Perhaps they valued it as a precious material precisely because it was difficult to obtain, the way we might value gold or diamonds today. Perhaps it represented something about the connection between distant lands, the reaching out across vast distances to bring the sacred into the city. Or perhaps, and this is a possibility that some researchers have suggested, the mica served some function we no longer understand, some purpose that made perfect sense to the Teotihuacanos, but that has been lost to time. The chambers filled with mica-laden floors, the way the material catches light, the knowledge that someone travelled thousands of kilometers to bring this back. It all speaks to a civilization with reach, with ambition, with access to trade networks that spanned continents. Mica is not an accident. It is not something you find by chance. It is something you obtain because you have decided it is important enough to deserve the effort. What does that say about Teotihuacan? What does it say about the values of a civilization that would go to such lengths to honor the material world with the presence of this distant stone? The reach of Teotihuacan extended across the landscape of Mesoamerica in ways that we are still working to understand. This city was not isolated. Its influence touched the great Maya cities hundreds of kilometers away, cities like Tikal and Copan, where archaeologists have found evidence of Teotihuacan's presence. Murals painted in the style of Teotihuacan appear in Maya cities. Pottery vessels that originated in Teotihuacan have been discovered in royal Maya tombs. The distinctive Teotihuacan style of warfare, with weapons and tactics that can be identified in Maya art, appears in scenes of conquest and violence. Did Teotihuacan conquer these distant cities? Did merchants travel those hundreds of kilometers carrying goods and influence? Did religious ideas spread across the landscape, carried by pilgrims or priests who journeyed to the great city and returned home transformed by what they had seen? The relationship between Teotihuacan and the Maya world is one of the great mysteries of Mesoamerica. The two civilizations developed differently, with the Maya creating a deciphered writing system and leaving us detailed records, while Teotihuacan remained silent. And yet they clearly interacted, exchanged goods, influenced each other, perhaps even engaged in conflict. What was the nature of this relationship? Was there a moment when ambassadors from Teotihuacan travelled to Tikal? Was there a moment when Maya priests made the long journey north to see the great pyramids for themselves? We do not know. We have only the artifacts, the pottery, the murals, the fragments of evidence that suggest a connection too strong to be accidental. Think about the implications of this as you relax into sleep. Two of the greatest civilizations of the ancient world, separated by hundreds of kilometers of jungle, different in their languages, their writing systems, their apparent governance structures, and yet connected to each other, aware of each other, influenced by each other. The Mesoamerican world was not a collection of isolated kingdoms, but a network of interconnected civilizations, linked by trade, by religion, by the movement of people and ideas across vast distances. Teotihuacan sat at the heart of this network, a city so magnificent, so influential, that its impact reached across the landscape and touched the great cities of the Maya world. And yet we know so little about how this influence functioned, what was exchanged, how the relationship evolved over the centuries. If the Calm Archive has become part of your bedtime routine, I'd love it if you shared this video with someone who might need it tonight, and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Now, where were we? Ah yes, still contemplating these mysteries, still sitting with the profound unknowns that make Teotihuacan so endlessly fascinating. These mysteries do not need to be solved to be beautiful. They do not require answers to be meaningful. In fact, perhaps their greatest power lies precisely in their resistance to simple explanation, in their invitation to us to sit with wonder, to acknowledge that some things in this world will remain unknown, and that in that unknowing there is a kind of peace. The city's silence is part of its majesty. The absence of a ruler's name is part of its mystery. The sealed chambers beneath the temples, the astronomical alignments, the distant Mika, the influence reaching across ancient landscapes, all of these speak not to a civilization that we can fully understand, but to one that will always, in some fundamental way, remain just beyond our complete comprehension. And perhaps that is exactly how it should be. Perhaps that mystery is the city's final gift to us, a reminder that human knowledge, for all its power and reach, always encounters the limits of its own understanding, and in those limits there is a particular kind of beauty, a quiet and contemplative beauty that can accompany you gently into sleep. Imagine waking one morning in the year 550 of the Common Era, not as one of the great administrators or priests at the peak of Teotihuacan's power, but as an ordinary person living in one of the apartment compounds that made up this sprawling city. The dawn would have felt much like any other dawn, the sun rising behind the distant mountains, painting the stone buildings in shades of rust and amber. You would have stepped out onto the flat roof of your family's quarters, perhaps drawing a clay vessel of water from the cistern that had been maintained by your community for generations. The water would have tasted familiar. The air would have carried the same weight, the same subtle scent of limestone dust and morning cooking fires that you'd known your entire life. And yet, even though you couldn't have known it in that moment, something was changing. Something fundamental was beginning to shift beneath the surface of this magnificent civilization, like a slow current moving beneath still water. By the year 600 of the Common Era, the transformation would have become visible. Not as a sudden catastrophe, not as the dramatic collapse we often imagine when we think of fallen empires, but as something more gradual, more complex, more human. The city that had once housed 200,000 people, a population that rivaled Rome at its height, a civilization that had no written language to document its own decline, was beginning to reorganize itself, and embedded in the archaeological record of this period, preserved in ash and charred stone, in the careful examination of which buildings were burned and which were left standing, we find clues to one of the great mysteries of ancient Mesoamerica. Not how the city fell, but why it chose to fall. The evidence for deliberate burning is unmistakable to anyone who has walked through the ruins along the Avenue of the Dead. Stand before what remains of the Pyramid of the Moon, or the Temple of Quetzalcoatl, or the great residential compounds of Xololpan, and you can see the scorch marks on the stone. You can observe, with careful attention, that these are not the random burns of a city consumed by wildfire. Instead, the burning was selective, systematic, and deliberately focused on particular categories of buildings. The temples, the massive ceremonial structures that represented the power of the priestly class, the elaborate facades that stood along the avenue, the ritual spaces where only the elite were permitted to gather, these were burned. Sometimes they were burned so intensely that the stone itself fractured and cracked. Wooden roof beams that once soared across these temples were reduced to ash, leaving cavities in the stone that reveal exactly where the most intense heat was concentrated. But something remarkable happened in other parts of the city. The residential compounds, the thousands of apartment blocks where ordinary people lived, where they cooked and slept and raised their children, these were largely left untouched. The workshops where artisans made pottery and obsidian blades and jade figurines, the markets where goods were exchanged, the neighborhoods that formed the actual living city, these spaces show no evidence of destruction. This distinction is profoundly important. It tells us that whoever burned the temples of Teotihuacan was not trying to destroy the city itself. They were not attempting to obliterate the civilization. Instead, they appear to have been making a statement, They were targeting symbols of power. They were eliminating the structures that housed and represented the authority of those who ruled. This has led many archaeologists and historians to consider a haunting possibility, that what happened at Teotihuacan around the year 550 to 600 AD was not a conquest by foreign armies or a collapse brought on entirely by environmental disaster, but rather something that emerged from within the city itself. What if the common people, the vast majority of the population who lived in those untouched residential compounds, rose against the ruling class? What if the burning of the temples was an act of deliberate rejection, a moment when the exploited many decided that the power of the few was no longer tolerable? This theory, sometimes called the internal revolution hypothesis, rests on the pattern of destruction we observe in the archaeology, on the absence of evidence for warfare with external enemies, and on the simple recognition that any system of control, no matter how effective, ultimately depends on the acquiescence of those being controlled. Imagine the tension that might have built over centuries. Imagine being one of those common people, living in your apartment compound, working in a craft or trade, supporting a system of governance that demanded your labour and your tribute but offered you very little in return. Imagine watching, generation after generation, as the elite grew more elaborate in their ceremonies, as they built bigger temples, as they accumulated more jade and obsidian and the rarer shells brought from distant coasts. Imagine the whispers that might have spread through the neighbourhoods. Imagine the moment when someone, perhaps a respected artisan, perhaps a group of neighbourhood leaders, decided that the system had become unsustainable. Imagine the night when they gathered their neighbours, when they moved together toward the Temple of Quetzalcoatl or the Pyramid of the Moon, and when they set fire to the structures that represented everything they wanted to overthrow. We cannot know for certain whether this is what happened. Archaeology reveals patterns and suggests possibilities, but it cannot give us access to the motivations of people who lived 15 centuries ago. And yet, the pattern itself is suggestive. The pattern itself contains a narrative that resonates with something deep in human experience. It suggests that even the most stable and seemingly inevitable systems of power contain within them the seeds of their own transformation. It suggests that the people of Teotihuacan, after centuries of supporting an elite ruling class, reached a moment where they chose differently. It is a moment worth sitting with, worth contemplating as you rest and your mind moves through these ancient stories. But the burning of the temples alone cannot explain everything that followed. Because even if the internal revolution theory is correct, even if the common people did rise against their rulers, something else was happening in the world around Teotihuacan. The climate itself was becoming unstable. The environment that had sustained this city for nearly 7 centuries was undergoing changes that would have been deeply disruptive to the systems that kept such a large population fed and stable. The evidence for environmental stress during this period comes from multiple sources. Tree rings from ancient wood, analysed with the precision that only modern science allows, show a pattern of reduced growth during the 6th century. This means the trees were stressed by something: reduced rainfall, changed weather patterns, or both. Pollen cores extracted from lakes in the Valley of Mexico show a decline in pollen from agricultural crops, and a corresponding increase in pollen from plants that typically flourish in drier conditions. Soil samples reveal a depletion of nutrients, a sign that the intensive agriculture that had supported the city for so long had exhausted the fertility of the land. All of these lines of evidence point to the same conclusion. Teotihuacan was facing a severe environmental challenge during the very period when internal tensions were rising. A prolonged drought would have been catastrophic to a city of Teotihuacan's size. 200,000 people required constant provision. The sophisticated system of terraces and channels and reservoirs that the engineers of Teotihuacan had built could manage the variations in rainfall that occurred in normal years, but it could not sustain a decade or more of significantly reduced precipitation. The tributaries that fed the city's system of water management would have declined. The springs that were carefully channeled into the residential compounds would have run lower. The agricultural lands around the city would have been unable to produce yields sufficient to feed such a massive population. This is the brutal mathematics of a civilization dependent on a particular environmental state. Change the environment, and the civilization must adapt or collapse. There is also the question of deforestation. Teotihuacan was built in a landscape that had been transformed by the city's construction and expansion. Enormous quantities of wood were needed to build the vast residential compounds, to create the scaffolding required to construct the pyramids, to fuel the kilns where lime for plaster was burned, to cook food in communal ovens and heating fires. Over the course of 7 centuries, as the city grew and grew, the forests that surrounded it were cleared and thinned. This deforestation would have had multiple consequences. Less wood available for heating and construction, less transpiration from forest vegetation contributing to local moisture, less root systems stabilizing the soil and enhancing its capacity to retain water. The very act of building and maintaining this great city may have degraded the environmental conditions that made it possible. Soil exhaustion is perhaps the most subtle but ultimately most significant form of environmental damage. The agricultural fields that surrounded Teotihuacan were worked intensively for centuries. The same land was planted again and again with the same crops: maize, beans, squash, the fundamental crops of Mesoamerican agriculture. Without the rotation of fields, without allowing land to lie fallow and recover its nutrients, without the input of organic matter to replenish what was taken out by harvests, the soil gradually lost its capacity to support productive agriculture. The farmers of Teotihuacan may have fought against this decline with every technique available to them. They may have developed new composting methods, may have adjusted their crop rotations, may have terraced and enhanced their fields with added soil. But at a certain point the mathematics becomes implacable. Too many people in one place, dependent on a fixed amount of agricultural land, and the land itself begins to fail. Imagine then the way these environmental challenges would have intersected with the political tensions within the city. Imagine the ruling elite, watching their authority begin to erode, attempting to maintain power through elaborate rituals and ceremonies. Imagine the drought reducing crop yields. Imagine the nobility demanding tributes even as the people had less to give. Imagine the rulers attributing the environmental crisis to a failure of the gods, and responding by performing even more elaborate ceremonies, demanding even greater offerings, insisting that only their direct connection to the divine could restore fertility to the land. And imagine, in this context, the moment when the people decided they had suffered enough. The moment when they chose to burn the temples not as an act of chaos, but as an act of refusal. A refusal to continue supporting a system that had failed them. A refusal to believe that the gods demanded what the gods were not delivering. What makes this moment in Teotihuacan's history so profoundly different from the typical narrative of collapse is that the city did not simply dissolve into chaos and despair. The population did not die. The civilization did not end in darkness and ruin. Instead, the people dispersed. They relocated. They spread out across the Valley of Mexico and beyond, taking with them the skills they had learned, the technologies they had mastered, the cultural traditions and religious beliefs that had shaped their lives. Some may have migrated to smaller settlements in the valley. Some may have travelled further afield, carrying Teotihuacan's influence into the territories of what would eventually become the Aztec Empire. Some may have integrated into other existing communities, sharing their knowledge of agriculture, of craft, of administration. This dispersal is perhaps the most important thing to understand about Teotihuacan's fall. The city did not fail and leave nothing behind. It transformed. The extraordinary civilization that had flourished for 7 centuries did not collapse into oblivion. It dissolved into its constituent parts and spread across a landscape, like water returning to the earth from which it had briefly been gathered. The art, the architecture, the religious symbols, the technological knowledge, all of it persisted. All of it continued to influence the societies that emerged in Mesoamerica in the centuries to come. The legacy of Teotihuacan is written into the very foundation of later Mesoamerican civilization. The architectural forms pioneered at Teotihuacan became the standard for pyramid construction throughout the region. The style of mural painting that decorated the residential compounds influenced artistic traditions for centuries. The religious iconography, the feathered serpent, the storm god, the various deities and supernatural beings depicted in the city's art were absorbed and adapted by subsequent civilizations. When you look at the art and architecture of the classic Maya cities that flourished in the south, you can see clear influences from Teotihuacan. When you examine the pyramid structures built by later peoples in central Mexico, you recognize in them the design principles that were perfected at Teotihuacan. The city's cultural influence extended far beyond its political boundaries, and this influence persisted long after the city itself had been abandoned. Centuries passed. The pyramids of Teotihuacan stood silent under the sun, slowly being overtaken by vegetation. Rain fell on the limestone surfaces, and vegetation took root in crevices and cracks. Dust accumulated on the flat surfaces. The residential compounds no longer occupied slowly crumbled. The carefully maintained waterworks no longer cleaned and maintained fell into disrepair. The city that had once been alive with the voices of 200,000 people became quieter, emptier, more ghostly with each passing generation. By the year 1200, 8 centuries after the city had begun its decline, the sites that had once thrived with human activity were largely overgrown. Forests grew up around the pyramids. The Avenue of the Dead, once crowded with processions and ceremonies, became a pathway through vegetation. And then came the Aztecs. The Aztec people arrived in the Valley of Mexico sometime in the 12th century, seeking a place to establish their civilization. They were, by most accounts, not the dominant power in the region when they first arrived. They were outsiders, migrants, a people searching for a home. And as they explored the valley, they came across the ruins of Teotihuacan. They saw the enormous pyramids rising from the overgrown landscape. They saw the remains of the great city that had been built centuries before their own time. They saw evidence of a civilization so vast, so technically sophisticated, so thoroughly organized that it could only have been the work of the gods themselves. The Aztecs did not have written records of what Teotihuacan had been. The knowledge of the city's actual history was lost. Instead, they constructed a mythology around these ruins. They believed that the pyramids had been built by an ancient race of giants, or by the gods themselves. They wove the ruins into their own cosmological stories. The Great Pyramid became the Pyramid of the Sun, and it was incorporated into Aztec creation mythology. They believed that at the location of Teotihuacan, the gods had gathered to decide how to create the sun and the moon. They believed that this was a place of cosmic significance, a place where the divine and the earthly intersected, and so, even though the Aztecs were separated from the people who actually built Teotihuacan by nearly 1,000 years, they recognized the magnificence of what they had found. They understood, in their own way, that they were in the presence of something extraordinary. The Aztecs made pilgrimages to Teotihuacan. They travelled from their capital city of Tenochtitlan to walk the Avenue of the Dead, to climb the pyramids, to make offerings to the gods in what they understood to be a sacred place. They incorporated Teotihuacan into their own religious practices and their own sense of history. In doing so, they kept the memory of the city alive, even if they could not remember who had actually built it. They preserved its significance in their consciousness, ensured that it would not be entirely forgotten, even as the jungle reclaimed more of the ruins with each passing year. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in Mexico in the early 16th century, they encountered the Aztec Empire at the height of its power, and they encountered the ruins of Teotihuacan as well. Spanish chroniclers wrote about the city, describing the pyramids and the streets, attempting to understand what they were seeing. But the knowledge of how to read the city, how to understand the details of its construction, how to interpret its meanings, had been lost. The city became a mystery, a ruin, a place of speculation and wonder. It was not until the 20th century, with the development of modern, archaeological methods, that serious scientific investigation of Teotihuacan began. Archaeologists used new techniques to probe the secrets that the city had preserved in stone and soil. They excavated tunnels, not just to uncover what lay beneath the surface, but to understand the internal structure of the pyramids. They found evidence of earlier, smaller structures buried within the Great Pyramids, evidence that showed how the city had grown and evolved over centuries. They discovered temples hidden within the massive stone structures, places where the earliest ceremonies had been performed before the pyramids grew to their full size. In the last 50 years, the pace of discovery has accelerated dramatically. Ground-penetrating radar has allowed archaeologists to see beneath the surface of the Earth without excavating, to detect structures that are buried, to create maps of the underground city that existed beneath the visible ruins. Chemical analysis of soil samples and human remains has provided information about diet, about disease, about the daily lives of ordinary people. DNA analysis has revealed information about genetic relationships, about where people came from, about how population moved through the valley and beyond. Tunnel excavations beneath the pyramids have revealed chambers and passages that had remained sealed for over 1,000 years, containing artifacts and artistic representations that provide windows into the spiritual and ceremonial life of the city. One of the most remarkable discoveries came in 2010, when archaeologists found evidence of a previously unknown chamber beneath the Temple of the Feathered Serpent. a burial chamber that had been sealed for centuries. The chamber contained offerings of jade, obsidian, shells, and other precious materials, speaking to the elaborate rituals that surrounded death and the afterlife in Teotihuacan. More recently, work continues beneath the Pyramid of the Sun, where archaeologists have discovered chambers and passages, and where every new discovery adds another fragment to our understanding of what the city was, how it functioned, and what it meant to the people who lived there. The chemical analysis of the limestone and other stones used to construct the pyramids has revealed something surprising. The builders of Teotihuacan were incredibly sophisticated in their use of materials. They selected specific types of stone for specific purposes. They understood the properties of the different materials they worked with. They engineered structures that would endure for millennia, that would remain standing long after the civilization that built them had ceased to exist. This speaks to a profound commitment to permanence, to a desire to build something that would outlast the builders themselves, something that would speak to generations yet unborn. The murals that have been carefully excavated and preserved provide some of the most intimate and vivid glimpses into the life and belief system of Teotihuacan. These painted walls depict religious ceremonies, supernatural beings, natural elements like water and plants, and scenes that seem to represent the organization and hierarchy of society. The colors, brilliant reds and blues, soft greens and yellows, remain vibrant after more than 1,000 years, speaking to the quality of the pigments and the skill of the artisans. When you look at these murals, you're looking at the aesthetic sensibility of a civilization. You're seeing what was beautiful to them, what mattered enough to paint on the walls of their homes. As we contemplate the fall and dispersal of Teotihuacan, we might ask ourselves what we are looking at, what this moment in history represents. Is it failure? In one sense, yes, the city that had dominated the region for centuries could not sustain itself indefinitely. But is it tragedy? Perhaps not. The people did not die en masse. The culture did not disappear. Instead, what we see is transformation. We see a civilization recognizing that the form it had taken could no longer be sustained, and choosing to dissolve and reshape itself. We see the dispersal of knowledge and culture across a landscape. We see the legacy that persisted for centuries, incorporated into the beliefs and practices of the peoples who came after. There is something deeply human in this story. Teotihuacan fell not because its people were weak or foolish, but because no civilization can endure forever in the same form. The environmental challenges were real and severe. The social tensions were real and consequential. The moment came when the system that had worked for 7 centuries could no longer work, and the people chose to move, to adapt, to begin again in different forms and different places. They carried with them the knowledge and the culture that had been created in this place, and they planted those seeds across the landscape, where they took root and grew in new ways. The ruins of Teotihuacan stand today as a testimony to this journey. They stand as evidence of human achievement, of the capacity to build, to organize, to create beauty and meaning. But they stand also as evidence of something perhaps more important. They stand as evidence that even the grandest human creations are impermanent, that all things change, that the fall of a civilization is not always a tragedy, but sometimes a transformation. They stand as a reminder that we are part of a long continuity of human striving and adaptation, that our own moment is not permanent, that what we build will endure only if it remains worthy of the effort, and that sometimes the greatest wisdom is knowing when to let go, when to move on, when to allow what we have created to dissolve and reshape itself into something new. As you rest with this history, as you allow these thoughts to settle into the quietness of your mind before sleep, remember that you are connected to this story. You are descended from the long human journey that includes Teotihuacan, the people who built it, the people who watched it transform, the people who carried its legacy into the future. The resilience and adaptability that allowed the people of Teotihuacan to survive their civilization's fall is part of what you inherit. The beauty that they created, the knowledge they accumulated, the systems they designed, all of it is part of the inheritance of human culture, and the city itself, silent now, its great pyramids standing in the sun, continues to speak across the centuries, telling us stories of who we were and perhaps suggesting something about who we might become. We've journeyed together through the heights and depths of Teotihuacan, haven't we? Through the great pyramids that still touch the sky, through the hidden water systems that sustained a civilization, through the quiet mysteries that archaeologists continue to uncover with each passing season. And now, as we draw closer to the end of our time together this evening, I want to invite you to walk with me one more time through these ancient streets, but this time in a different way. This time, we're going to experience Teotihuacan not as a puzzle to be solved or a mystery to be explained, but as a place of profound calm and deep, comforting reflection. Before we settle fully into that quietness, though, I want to say thank you. Thank you for spending your evening with the Calm Archive. If this journey through Teotihuacan has helped you relax tonight, helped you find a moment of peace in your day, I hope you'll subscribe so you never miss a new video. I upload regularly, and there's always something new to drift off to. Ancient cities waiting in the darkness, stories of human achievement whispered just for you in the stillness of the night. Tell me in the comments, if you would, if you could visit any ancient city in the world, which one would you choose? What destination calls to you in your dreams? I read every comment and I'd love to know where your imagination takes you. But now, let's return to Teotihuacan, to that extraordinary place where 200,000 people once thrived without a river to sustain them. Imagine, if you will, standing at the entrance to the archaeological zone on a quiet afternoon, when the crowds have begun to thin and the sun is lower on the horizon. The light is gentler now, softer, more golden. The air feels warm, still holding the heat of the day but beginning to cool with the approach of evening. This is the time when many visitors walk the Avenue of the Dead, and there's something particularly peaceful about this moment. The stone beneath your feet is still warm, still radiating the heat it absorbed during the bright hours of the day. You can feel that warmth through your shoes, through the soles of your feet, grounding you to this earth that has held these monuments for more than 1,500 years. As you walk slowly down that great avenue, you might notice how the shadows have grown longer, how they stretch across the pavement in deep blue and purple tones. The Pyramid of the Sun rises before you, and in this softer light it seems almost to float, almost to exist in two worlds at once. Solid stone and something more ethereal, more dreamlike. The angles of the pyramid create patterns of light and shadow that shift and change as you move, as if the pyramid itself is breathing, is alive in a way that only ancient places can be alive. This is not the aggressive sunlight of midday, but a gentler illumination, one that invites contemplation rather than demanding attention. If you were to climb the pyramid at this time of day, and many visitors do, you would find that the climb feels different than it might in the bright morning. Each step is deliberate, measured, slower. The 248 steps seem to unfold endlessly before you, and yet each one brings you higher, brings you closer to something that feels almost spiritual. When you reach the summit, breathless but calm, you would turn and look out over the vast expanse of Teotihuacan spread below you. From this height, you can see the entire layout of the city, the Avenue of the Dead stretching north and south like a spine, the buildings and structures arranged in their careful, mathematical precision, and all around this ancient city is the modern world. But from up here, from this height, it feels distant, almost unreal. What feels real is the wind on your face, the solid stone beneath your feet, the vast sky above, and the sense that you are standing where millions of feet have stood before. This experience of Teotihuacan today is quite different from the experience of visiting most other archaeological sites. Because while the pyramids at Giza or Machu Picchu have been studied intensively and are presented to visitors with a kind of finality, as if we know everything about them, Teotihuacan remains, in many ways, a mystery. It remains a place where secrets are still being discovered, where the earth is still giving up its hidden stories, and this ongoing sense of discovery, this feeling that the city has more to tell us, gives Teotihuacan a unique quality. It feels alive in a way that a fully mapped and thoroughly understood site might not. It feels like a place that is still speaking, still teaching, still revealing itself to those patient and respectful enough to listen. In recent years and decades, archaeologists have continued to make discoveries that reshape our understanding of Teotihuacan. In 2010, using advanced technology, researchers identified a previously unknown tunnel beneath the Pyramid of the Sun. This tunnel, created by the ancient people of Teotihuacan more than 2,000 years ago, runs horizontally through the pyramid, leading to a chamber deep within. The discovery of this tunnel was thrilling for archaeologists because it suggested that the very heart of the pyramid might contain sacred objects, might hold spiritual or ceremonial significance that we are only beginning to understand. This tunnel remains largely unexplored, sealed off to protect it and to allow archaeologists to approach the excavation with the utmost care and respect. But its very existence reminds us that there is so much we do not yet know, so much that remains hidden, waiting to be discovered. More recently, archaeologists have continued to use non-invasive technologies, ground-penetrating radar, 3D imaging and other sophisticated methods to peer beneath the surface of Teotihuacan without disturbing the precious archaeological record. These tools have revealed networks of tunnels and chambers that suggest the ancient people of Teotihuacan were doing things we are still struggling to fully understand. They were creating spaces beneath the pyramids, spaces that may have been used for ritual purposes, for storage, for ceremonies that connected the human world with the world of the spirits and the gods. Each discovery adds another layer to our understanding. Each finding complicates and enriches our picture of who these people were and how they lived. And there is something deeply comforting about this ongoing process of discovery, isn't there? It means that Teotihuacan is not a closed chapter, a finished story. It means that the city is still teaching us, still offering up its wisdom to those patient enough to listen. It means that even after 1,500 years of decay, even after the collapse of the civilization that built it, even after centuries of being overgrown and forgotten and then rediscovered, Teotihuacan continues to speak. The stones continue to hold their secrets, and those secrets continue, slowly and carefully, to be revealed. As you stand among these ruins, whether you're actually visiting this place or imagining it in the darkness of the evening as you prepare for sleep, there is a particular lesson that Teotihuacan seems to whisper. It is a lesson about water, yes, but it is also a lesson about something much deeper, about human creativity, about the capacity of the human mind and human hands to solve problems that seem, at first glance, impossible to solve. When the people of Teotihuacan looked at their situation, a high plateau, far from any significant river, in a climate that did not naturally provide abundant water, they did not despair. They did not say, "This is impossible, we cannot build a great city here." Instead, they began to think. They began to observe. They began to understand the patterns of rainfall, the ways that water moved through their landscape, the places where water could be captured and stored and used. And from that observation, from that creativity, from that determination to not accept the limitations that nature seemed to impose, they built something extraordinary. They created an aqueduct system that was a marvel of ancient engineering. They built underground channels that fed water to every corner of their city. They constructed reservoirs and basins that captured every precious drop of water during the rainy season so that it could sustain them through the dry months. They learned to harvest rainwater from rooftops and streets. They cultivated gardens in specific locations where they knew water would be available. They created chinampas, those floating gardens, in the shallow lakes that surrounded their city. In doing all of this, they transformed a seemingly impossible place into a thriving metropolis of 200,000 people. And there is something in this that speaks to something deep within us, isn't there? There is something that resonates with a truth we all know, but perhaps do not always remember. The truth is that the greatest challenges often produce the most creative solutions. The truth is that limitation sometimes breeds innovation in a way that abundance never can. If Teotihuacan had been built next to a great river, if water had been abundant and easy, would the people there have developed such sophisticated systems for managing and preserving it? Would they have become such skilled engineers and observers of nature? The constraints of their situation, rather than preventing them from succeeding, actually pushed them toward a kind of mastery that is awe-inspiring to contemplate even today. This lesson feels particularly relevant to us as we sit here in the modern world, doesn't it? We live in a time of great challenges, climate challenges, water scarcity in many parts of the world, the need to create sustainable systems that can support our growing populations. And when we look at the example of Teotihuacan, when we see what human beings were capable of accomplishing 2,000 years ago without any modern technology, without computers or advanced machinery, with nothing but observation, creativity and determination, it gives us something. It gives us hope. It gives us inspiration. It reminds us that human beings have always been capable of extraordinary things when they are motivated by necessity and guided by careful thought. The people who built Teotihuacan were not superhuman. They were not magical beings or representatives of some lost advanced civilization, despite what some imaginative theories might suggest. They were ordinary people. They were farmers and builders and engineers and artists and priests and merchants and children and elders. They were people like us, with the same basic human needs and desires and fears. They wanted to feed their families. They wanted to create beautiful things. They wanted to build a society that worked, that was orderly, that made sense. They wanted to create something that would last, that would be remembered. And in working toward those ordinary goals, in solving the practical problems that face them every day, they created something that is still extraordinary more than 1,500 years later. This is perhaps the most important lesson that Teotihuacan has to teach us. Not that human beings are capable of amazing feats of engineering, or art or organization, though we certainly are. Food, that repair tools that gather, and food, that repair tools that gather and carry water. Those same hands can also build pyramids that rise hundreds of feet into the sky. The same minds that solve daily problems, that figure out how to make things work, that observe patterns and make connections. Those same minds can also conceive of and execute plans of stunning complexity and beauty. Every single person who lived in Teotihuacan, every person who walked those streets and slept in those homes and worked in those fields and climbed those pyramids, was doing something extraordinary simply by being part of that great achievement. And in that way, they are not so different from us at all. We too are part of something larger than ourselves. We too are connected to a great human story that stretches backward and forward through time. Imagine now, if you will, the experience of being in Teotihuacan at night. The archaeological site closes to visitors at sunset, of course, but imagine for a moment that you were able to stay, to be there as the light faded completely and the stars emerged. The ruins, which seemed so massive and solid and full of geometric precision in the daylight, take on a different character in darkness. The pyramids become silhouettes against the darkening sky. The Avenue of the Dead becomes a pathway that seems to lead not just north and south through the ancient city, but perhaps into other realms entirely, into the realm of the spirits and ancestors. The stone, still holding some of the warmth from the day, feels different under your feet in darkness. It feels almost alive, as if it has its own heartbeat, its own slow patience. The stars above are extraordinary at Teotihuacan. The site is located on a high plateau, and it is far from the light pollution of major cities. On a clear night, the stars are bright and numerous, and they cover the entire sky in a way that might be lost to those of us who live in urban areas. The same stars that the ancient people of Teotihuacan saw when they stood here 2,000 years ago are the stars you would see. The constellations have shifted slightly. The rotation of the Earth causes this change over vast periods of time, but many of the patterns would still be recognizable to them. The night sky above Teotihuacan connects us directly to the people who built this city. We are looking at the same universe that they looked at. We are standing on the same ground and looking up at the same stars. In ancient Mesoamerica, the night sky held profound spiritual significance. The movements of the stars and planets were tracked carefully by priests and astronomers. The great cycles of the cosmos were understood to have meaning and relevance to human life on Earth. The pyramids themselves may have been oriented with reference to celestial events, sunrise and sunset at particular times of year, the rising and setting of particular stars or planets. So when the people of Teotihuacan looked up at the night sky, they were not just looking at beautiful lights in the darkness. They were looking at a cosmic map, a sacred text written in a light and darkness. They were connecting themselves to forces much larger than themselves, to the great cycles of creation and death and renewal that govern the universe. As you imagine yourself standing in the ruins of Teotihuacan at night, surrounded by darkness and quiet and ancient stone, it becomes easier to understand why this place had such power, why it could sustain the spiritual and emotional lives of 200,000 people for centuries. It was not just the engineering achievement or the architectural ambition, it was also the sense of connection, the feeling of being part of something larger, something that mattered, something that was connected to forces beyond the merely human. To live in Teotihuacan was to live in a place where the human and the divine were not separate, where daily life and spiritual life were woven together, where every action and every achievement was understood to have meaning. Now, as we approach the end of our time together this evening, I want to bring us back to where we started. We began with the image of walking through the ruins of Teotihuacan, hearing the silence where 200,000 voices once lived. We imagined the vastness of the Pyramid of the Sun, the mathematical precision of the Avenue of the Dead, the complexity of the water systems that kept this great city alive. We followed the city through its rise and its flourishing and its eventual decline. We explored the mysteries that remain, the questions that archaeologists continue to ask, the secrets that the earth is still slowly revealing. And now, having walked that entire journey together, having sat with the story of Teotihuacan and let it settle into us like sediment settling to the bottom of still water, we are ready to rest. We are ready to let go of our questions and our wondering and our seeking. We are ready to simply be present to what is, to the quiet, to the darkness, to the comfort of our beds and the warmth of our blankets. The story of Teotihuacan will still be there tomorrow, still waiting to be explored and wondered about. But tonight, we can let it go. Tonight, we can let it fade into the background of our consciousness like the stars fading as dawn approaches. The city of Teotihuacan is gone now. At least the living, breathing city full of people is gone. But it is not truly gone. It persists in the stones that still stand, in the earth that still holds the secrets of its layout and its systems, in the minds and imaginations of those who visit it, and those who study it, and those who listen to its stories. It persists in us, in the ways that its example shapes our thinking about human creativity and human possibility. A city that fed 200,000 people with no river. This is a fact that stays with us, that challenges us, that inspires us. This is a reminder that human beings are capable of extraordinary things. This is a reminder that limitation and challenge, rather than preventing achievement, sometimes produce the most remarkable results. And so, I want to leave you with this image to carry into sleep with you. I want you to imagine yourself walking slowly, very slowly, down the Avenue of the Dead in the soft darkness of evening. The day is ending. The warmth of the sun is beginning to fade from the stones. The air is growing cool and gentle. All around you are the remains of a great civilization, the physical manifestations of human dreams and human effort and human creativity. And you are walking through this place with a sense of peace, with a sense of understanding, with the knowledge that you are connected to all of this, to the people who built it, to the water systems that sustained them, to the stars they watched, to the earth they shaped according to their vision. You're part of a long human story that includes Teotihuacan, that includes every great achievement and every daily effort, every triumph and every struggle. You are connected to the hands that built these pyramids and the minds that imagined them. You're standing on the same earth, looking at the same sky, breathing the same air that has existed on this planet since the beginning of time. And in this moment, in this quiet evening walk through the ruins of an ancient city, you can feel that connection. You can feel the vast sweep of human history and human effort. And you can feel too the peace that comes from understanding that you are part of something much larger than yourself, that your own efforts and achievements, no matter how small they might seem, are part of a great continuum of human creativity and human striving. As you walk, the monuments grow quieter, or perhaps it is you who grows quieter. The boundary between your own being and the ancient stones begins to blur. The coolness of the evening air feels like a gentle hand on your forehead, soothing you, settling you into a deeper and deeper state of rest. Your breathing becomes slower, more even, more natural. Each step feels lighter. Each thought becomes more distant, more peaceful. The great achievement of Teotihuacan, a city that fed 200,000 people with no river, begins to dissolve into something more abstract, more poetic. It becomes not a puzzle to be solved, but a feeling, a sense of deep human accomplishment and deep human peace. And now, as the evening deepens and the stars come out more fully, I want you to know that your rest is earned. Your mind has travelled far today, has explored mysteries and considered questions and walked through the corridors of ancient time. Your spirit has been fed by the story of human creativity and human determination. You have learned something about the power of the human mind to solve seemingly impossible problems, to create beauty and order from limitation and challenge. You have been reminded of your connection to all of human history, to all of those who came before you, and all of those who will come after. And now, it is time to rest. Let your body sink more deeply into your bed. Let the warmth of your blankets envelop you like the warm stone of Teotihuacan at sunset. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Feel the heaviness of rest beginning to settle into your limbs, beginning to quiet your thoughts, beginning to draw you down into the peaceful realm of sleep. There is nothing more to do this evening. There is nowhere else to go. You are home. You are safe. You are held by the earth itself, just as the stones of Teotihuacan are held, just as the ancient people who walk those streets were held. The great achievement of Teotihuacan, a city that fed 200,000 people with no river, can rest now. The mysteries can remain mysteries a little longer. The questions can wait for another day. Tonight is for rest, for the quiet restoration of sleep, for the peace that comes from being held in darkness and silence. Tonight, you are exactly where you need to be. And as sleep comes, gently, gradually, inevitably, know that you carry with you the wisdom of Teotihuacan. You carry within you the knowledge that human beings are capable of extraordinary things. You carry the peace of ancient stones and the comfort of knowing that your own small efforts are part of a vast human story. Sleep now, rest deeply, and when you wake, Teotihuacan will still be there, still standing, still teaching, still feeding the human spirit with its profound and quiet lessons about creativity, resilience, and the remarkable things that ordinary people can accomplish when they refuse to accept the limitations that seem to surround them. Sleep well, dear friend. You have earned your rest. The city can wait. The mysteries can wait. All is well. All is peaceful. All is as it should be. Sleep now into the gentle darkness, into the warm embrace of rest. Home at last.